Who taught you that language? Elena Rossi set the glass down slowly and looked straight at the most dangerous man in Brooklyn. My grandmother. The bodyguards froze. 3 men reached for weapons they never drew. Marco Bellini, the Mafia boss who made city councilmen lose sleep, stared at a tired waitress in a stained apron, who had just answered him in a Sicilian dialect his own grandfather barely remembered. Nobody spoke to Marco that way. Nobody even understood him when he switched to that language. Until tonight. If this story already has you hooked, hit subscribe right now and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The restaurant had been struggling for 11 years. Not the kind of struggling that made the news. The kind that happened quietly, the way old things died a little slower every season. A little more worn down every winter. Until one day you looked around and realized you were the last one still trying to hold something together that the rest of the world had already given up on. Nico's on Fulton Street had 17 tables, a kitchen that ran too hot in summer and too cold in January, and a lunch menu that hadn't changed since the Clinton administration. The owner, an old man named Sal, who had immigrated from Palermo at 19, still came in every morning at 6 to make the bread himself. He said the machine made it wrong. He said everything modern made everything wrong. His regulars agreed with him, and his regulars were mostly retired men in their 70s who nursed espresso for 2 hours and talked about the neighborhood the way you talk about someone who has already died. Elena Rossi had worked at Nico's for 3 years. She was 26 years old, and she had the kind of face that people described as pretty but tired. The kind of tired that wasn't about sleep, but about carrying too much for too long without anyone offering to help. She had come to Brooklyn from a small town in upstate New York after her grandmother passed away, looking for work, looking for something she couldn't quite name, and finding mostly long shifts and short paychecks. She knew the names of every regular. She knew that Mr. Caruso took his coffee with 2 sugars and never wanted to talk about his son. She knew that the Benedetti sisters always split the tiramisu and always argued about who had eaten more. She knew that the booth by the window got a cold draft after 9 o'clock and that the chair closest to the kitchen door wobbled unless you put a folded napkin under the left leg. She knew everything about the restaurant and nothing about what was about to walk through its door. It was a Tuesday in late October, and she was running her 14th hour. Her feet had stopped hurting sometime around the 10th hour, which she had learned over 3 years meant the nerves had simply given up sending signals. She moved between tables on a kind of automatic pilot, her body doing the work while her mind kept calculating. Rent was due. In 6 days, she was $400 short. Her second job at the dry cleaner 2 blocks over had cut her hours because the owner's nephew needed work, and she had exactly $11.40 in her checking account. She was carrying a tray of water glasses to a back table when she heard the door open. She didn't look up right away. Tuesday nights were slow. The last customers usually came in by 8, and it was nearly 9. She set the glasses down, pulled out her notepad, and turned. 3 men in suits had walked in. Then 2 more behind them. Then another 2. 7 men all at once on a Tuesday night at 9 o'clock. The restaurant went quiet the way a street goes quiet when a dog smells something wrong. Mr. Caruso stopped talking mid-sentence. The Benedetti sisters put down their forks at the same moment without looking at each other. Even Sal, who was normally invisible behind the pass-through window, went still. Elena looked at the 7 men and saw the kind of stillness that came with consequence. These were not men who worried about whether their reservation was ready. These were men who assumed everything would be ready, and they were never wrong about that assumption. One of them, the one at the center, the one the others angled slightly toward without appearing to, was younger than she expected. He was 39, though he could have passed for younger in certain light and older in others, depending on whether you were looking at his face or his eyes. His face was controlled in the way of someone who had spent years deciding exactly what to show and what to keep hidden. His eyes were something else. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and processed all of it, who had filed everything away and could retrieve any of it instantly. He wore a dark suit that cost more than her monthly rent. He wore it the way men wear clothes that fit perfectly without thinking about it, because it had never occurred to him that clothes might not fit. He said nothing when he walked in. He didn't need to. The men around him moved to secure the room without a word passing between them, and two of the larger ones positioned themselves near the door. And the younger man walked directly to the corner booth in the back. The one Elena knew had the best sightline of the entire restaurant. The one where you could see every entry point without being seen from outside. He sat with his back to the wall. The other men distributed themselves around 3 adjacent tables. Elena stood there for a moment with her notepad still open. Sal appeared at the pass-through window and caught her eye with an expression she had never seen on him before. He was a man who had lived through Palermo in the 1960s and Brooklyn in the 1980s, and had claimed more than once that nothing surprised him anymore. He looked surprised. He also looked afraid. Elena walked to the corner booth. The man with the controlled face looked up at her. He didn't look at her the way most men looked at her, evaluating, calculating, deciding what she was worth to them. He looked at her the way you look at something that is simply there, part of the furniture, which was both insulting and somehow steadying. "Water," he said. "Anything to eat?" she asked. "Not yet." She wrote nothing on the notepad because there was nothing to write. She walked back to the bar, filled a glass, walked back, set it down without ceremony. He had already turned away, leaning toward the man on his left, saying something low and rapid that she couldn't catch. She went back to her other tables. For the next 40 minutes, the corner of the restaurant operated like a separate country with its own laws. The men spoke in English then, in fragments of Italian. She could mostly follow, then in something lower and faster that she only half caught. They passed documents across the table in the way that people pass things, when they don't want anyone to notice them passing things. 2 of them stepped outside and came back, and something in the atmosphere shifted when they returned. Elena refilled water glasses. She brought bread to the table without being asked because she could see they were going to be there a while. One of the men nodded at her. Another ignored her completely. The man in the center, the one who sat with his back to the wall, didn't acknowledge her at all. She was fine with that. She was calculating rent. At 9:47, the temperature at the corner table changed. She felt it before she saw it. A rise in tension, a tightening the way the air changes before a summer storm. The 2 men across from the center man had said something that landed badly. She couldn't hear what it was. She only saw the man's jaw set. He began to speak, and the language he spoke was not English. It was not the Italian she had been half following all evening. It was something older, something that came from somewhere further back, somewhere specific and rural and particular, a Sicilian dialect that carried in it the sound of a place she had never been, but somehow recognized, the way you recognize music, you heard as a very small child before you understood what music was. Her grandmother had spoken it, not Italian, not even modern Sicilian. The specific variant of her grandmother's village, the one the old woman had carried across the ocean and kept like a private treasure. The one she had spoken to Elena for years without any idea she was giving her granddaughter something rare. Elena stopped walking. She was 3 tables away. She shouldn't have been able to hear clearly. But the restaurant was quiet, and his voice, though controlled, carried. He was furious, not in the way people were furious when they raised their voices, in the way people were furious when they'd run out of the patience it took to keep the fury contained, and it began coming through the container anyway. He was telling the 2 men across from him that they had made a mistake he had told them not to make. He was telling them that the mistake was not simply in the action, but in the thinking that they had not thought ahead, that they had not considered consequence, that they had reacted instead of planned. And that reacting instead of planning was what separated men who built things from men who only broke them. He said his grandfather had told him this at the age of 7, and he had never forgotten it, and he could not understand why men who claimed to work for him still had not learned it. The words were old. The sentence structures were old. The phrasing carried weight that came from generations, and Elena understood every single word. She stood there with an empty tray, and the check for table 4, and a mind that had gone very, very still. She did not make a decision. Not exactly. It was more that the thing happened before she had time to decide whether to let it happen. One of the men at the corner table, not the center man, one of the others made a comment also in dialect that was dismissive in a way she found irritating. He was saying that the men in question were not worth this level of explanation. He was saying it in a way that suggested he felt the same words applied to several people in the room who were not part of the conversation, including she sensed her. "He's right," she said, in perfect Sicilian. The words were out before she had consciously formed them. They were simply there, the way words come when a language lives in your body rather than your memory. The way her grandmother's voice came back to her sometimes when she was half asleep, clear and close and warm. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. 7 men, all of them looking at her. The man by the door reached inside his jacket. "Don't," the center man said in English without looking at the man by the door. His eyes were on Elena. They were not angry eyes in that moment. They were something more complicated, alert, assessing, genuinely startled, in a way that the rest of his face was working to conceal. He studied her for a long moment. "Who taught you that language?" he asked in Sicilian slowly. "My grandmother," Elena said in Sicilian, not slowly. "And where was your grandmother from?" She put the empty tray under her arm. She looked at him steadily because she had been on her feet for 14 hours, and she was tired, and she had already committed to the thing, so there was no point in retreating now. "A village outside of Agrigento," she said. "She never told me the name. She only called it home." Something crossed his face. It was gone very quickly, but she caught it, a flicker of something she would have called recognition, except that didn't make sense. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elena Rossi." "Do you know who I am?" She looked at him. She looked at the 7 men and the suits, and the way Sal had looked at her from the pass-through window, and the particular quality of the silence in the restaurant since they walked in. "No," she said, "but I know what you are." The man to his right leaned forward. "Marco." "Sit down, Danny," the center man said, still in English, still without taking his eyes off Elena. Marco. She hadn't known the name before he said it. Now she turned it over in her mind, and it didn't tell her anything specific, but it confirmed the general shape of what she already suspected. "Bring me a coffee," Marco Bellini said. "We're closing in 20 minutes, Elena said. He looked at her for a beat. "Bring me a coffee," he said again. Not louder, not harder. Simply repeated in the tone of a man who had never once in his adult life had a request go unfulfilled and could not quite process that one might. "I'll see if there's still coffee made," she said, and walked back toward the bar. Behind her she heard someone exhale a long, releasing breath that might have been disbelief, or might have been relief that she was walking away from the table, rather than being carried away from it. Sal was at the bar when she got there, pretending to wipe down a glass that was already clean. "Do you know who that is?" he said, not looking at her. "I don't know his last name," she said, pulling out the coffee carafe. "Bellini," Sal said. "Marco Bellini." She poured the coffee. The name landed in her chest, but she kept her hands steady. "The carafe's almost empty," she said. "Should I make a fresh pot?" "Elena." Sal's voice was very quiet. That man's father was the reason 3 businesses on this street closed in 2009, and Marco Bellini is supposed to be worse. "Supposed to be?" she said. "That's not nothing." "I know." She put the carafe down. "Did I do something wrong, Sal?" The old man looked at her for a long moment. "You spoke to him in his grandfather's language." "My grandmother's language," she said. "Same one." Sal was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "Bring him his coffee," she said. She did. Marco Bellini accepted the cup without looking at it. His eyes were on the man to his left, who was talking now something about timelines, about delays, about a name she didn't recognize. Elena started to step back. "Stay," Marco said. She stopped. He still wasn't looking at her. He was listening to the man beside him, and he held up one finger, a minimal gesture, the kind of control that came from never needing to demand attention because it was always already there. The man finished speaking. Marco looked at Elena. "Translate what I just said," he said. "In Sicilian." "Exactly. What I said when you were 3 tables away." She understood what he was doing. He was testing whether she had understood everything, not just the surface of it. She met his eyes. "You told them they made a mistake you had warned them against. You told them the mistake wasn't the action itself, but the thinking or the lack of it. You said they reacted instead of planned, and that reacting instead of planning was what separated builders from breakers. You said your grandfather told you that when you were 7. A long silence. "And then," he said, "and then your man on the right said they weren't worth explaining it to." She paused. "I disagreed with the first part, not the second." Something shifted at the table. She heard it in the small sounds, a chair moving slightly, someone drawing breath through their teeth, the particular tension of men who were recalibrating. Marco looked at her for a long moment. "Sit down," he said. "I'm working," she said. "I'll pay for the table." "I'm not a table, Mr. Bellini." The silence that followed was different from the others. It was not dangerous. It was something she couldn't quite name, surprised, yes, but also something more considered. Danny, the man on his right, made a small sound that might have been suppressed laughter. Marco's eyes cut to him, and the sound stopped. "Then keep working," Marco said, turning back to the man on his left. "But don't go far." She didn't. She moved to other tables, cleared plates, brought bread she hadn't been asked for, watched the clock. But she stayed aware of the corner table, the way you stay aware of a fire in a room, not staring at it, but knowing exactly where it was and how close. At 10:40, after the last of the regular customers had quietly excused themselves and left faster than usual, she noticed barely touching their desserts. The room was down to Elena, Sal, and Marco Bellini's men. Sal came out from the kitchen with his coat on. "Elena," he said carefully. "Go ahead, Sal. I'll close up." "I don't think—" "I close up every Tuesday," she said. "Go home." Sal looked at Marco's table, then back at her. He said something very quiet in Sicilian, a phrase her grandmother used to use, something about God watching, something about the saints being with you when you didn't know you needed them. She felt something tighten in her chest. He left. The restaurant was quiet. Marco was looking at her again. "Your grandmother taught you to close up a restaurant in Sicilian," he said. "She taught me everything in Sicilian," Elena said. She started stacking chairs at the empty tables. It was the only way she still felt at home. "How old were you when she died?" She didn't stop stacking chairs. 23. I was with her." "And you moved here after—" "I needed a job." She set down a chair. "Mr. Bellini, do you want anything else, or are you planning to hold the restaurant hostage for the rest of the evening?" The man called Danny made the almost laugh sound again. This time Marco didn't cut it off. "One more coffee," Marco said. She brought it. He didn't drink it immediately. He held the cup and looked at the table and was quiet for a moment, in a way that she recognized the way someone was quiet when they were thinking about something they hadn't expected to be thinking about. "You said you know what I am," he said finally. "Yes." "And you're still here." "It's my job," she said. "You could have left with the old man." She considered him. "Could I have—" He looked up. "Yes," he said. And there was something in the word that surprised her directness. Honesty, the absence of the performance she had been expecting. "Yes, you could have." "Okay," she said. "I stayed because I need the tips." He studied her. "That's a lie." She was quiet for a moment. "Fine. I stayed because I was curious." Curious about what? She thought about it. About how to say it without sounding like she was trying to be interesting, which she wasn't. She was just trying to be honest. "I've heard that language my whole life, and I've never heard it spoken by someone angry about something real," she said. My grandmother was angry about small things, burned sauce, people who talked too loud at church, my grandfather who died before I was born, who she blamed for most of her problems. She put down the tray. You were angry about something that mattered. I wanted to hear the rest of it. Marco Bellini looked at her for a long time. Elena Rossi, he said finally. Yes. How much do they pay you here? She named the number. It was a small number. She watched something move across his face, not pity exactly, but the particular discomfort of a man who was not accustomed to thinking about how little some numbers were. I need someone who understands what I understand, he said. The language, what's behind it? I'm a waitress. I know what you are. Then you know I'm not a mob consultant. I know you're a woman who understood everything that was said at this table tonight and chose to speak up about exactly one thing. He set down the coffee cup. Which tells me you have more discipline than half the men I employ. The compliment landed strangely, not like a flattery, but like a fact being stated the way you'd state that a building was tall or a road was long. Mr. Bellini, she said, I have to finish closing this restaurant and catch the last train to Flatbush. I don't know what you want from me, but I'm not able to give it to you tonight. He looked at her for another long moment. Next Tuesday, he said. I work on Tuesdays. I know, he said. He stood, and the men around him moved without being directed, and he straightened his jacket and looked at her one more time with those eyes that processed everything and revealed nothing. I'll be here. He left. The restaurant emptied in under a minute. Elena stood alone in the middle of Nico's on Fulton Street with 12 chairs still to stack and $400 of rent still to find, and the sound of an old Sicilian dialect still ringing in her ears. She stacked the chairs. She wiped down the tables. She turned off the lights in the kitchen and the dining room and the little lamp by the register that Sal always forgot to turn off. She locked the door. She stood outside on the sidewalk in the cold October air and allowed herself for exactly 1 minute to feel the particular weight of something that had just changed without her consent. Then she walked to the train. She got home at 11:47. Her apartment was small. It was always cold because the radiator knocked twice and then gave up, and she had learned to sleep in 2 sweaters. She had a photograph of her grandmother on the shelf above the kitchen table. A small woman with a sharp face and enormous dark eyes and hands that had done too much work for too many years. She stood in front of the photograph for a moment. Nonna, she said in Sicilian, you would not believe this night. She could almost hear her grandmother laugh. Sharp and short and genuine the way she always laughed, like laughter was something you did quickly before someone tried to take it. Elena made herself a cup of tea. She sat at the kitchen table and thought about Marco Bellini. Not about what he was, not about the men with their hands on their jackets and the particular quality of the silence that had filled the restaurant when he walked in. About what he had said. Reacting instead of planning is what separates men who build things from men who only break them. Her grandmother had said something like that, not those exact words, but the shape of it, the same shape. She thought about that for a long time. The rent was still due in 6 days. She was still $400 short. At 12:45, her phone buzzed. She didn't recognize the number. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she answered. Silence. Then, how did you know I wouldn't hurt you? She recognized the voice immediately. She thought about how to answer honestly. I didn't, she said. But you didn't bring 7 men to a restaurant at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday to hurt a waitress. You brought them to have a meeting, and men who are having meetings want to be understood, not afraid. A pause. And you thought I wanted to be understood? I thought everyone does, she said. Even men like you. Another silence, this one longer. Get some sleep, Ms. Rossi, Marco Bellini said. It's late. He hung up. She set the phone down on the table. She looked at her grandmother's photograph for a long moment. Then she finished her tea. She did not know yet what she had walked into. She did not know the name of what was coming. She did not know that the language her grandmother had given her piece by piece, word by word on winter evenings in a small house in upstate New York was about to become the most valuable thing she owned. She only knew that a man had called her at 12:45 in the morning to ask a question he hadn't needed to ask, and that nobody calls someone at 12:45 to ask an unnecessary question unless they are already thinking about the next conversation. She went to bed. She lay in the dark in her 2 sweaters, with the radiator knocking twice and then going quiet, and she listened to the city outside, the particular sound of Brooklyn at 1 in the morning. A sound she had come to know, the way she had come to know everything in this life, slowly by herself, with no instruction. She thought about the way he'd said his grandfather's words, the weight in them, the way weight accumulated in words when they were given by someone who was already gone. She understood that part. She understood it completely. And somewhere underneath the fear, she had not quite let herself feel underneath the practical calculations about rent and train schedules, and what happened to people who wandered into worlds they didn't understand. There was something else, something that felt like recognition. Not of him, not yet. Of the language, of what it meant to carry something private that the world didn't know was there. She had carried it for years. Tonight, for the first time, someone had heard it. She closed her eyes. Outside, Brooklyn moved through the night the way it always did, loud and complicated and indifferent to the small, significant things happening inside it. And in a corner booth of a restaurant on Fulton Street, a conversation had ended. That was really, if anyone had been watching closely enough to see it, just beginning. She went back to work the next morning, like nothing had happened. That was the only way she knew how to handle things that were too large to process. Immediately put them on a shelf. Go through the motions, let the ordinary hours do their work. She made coffee. She rode the train. She tied her apron and took her first table at 10:15 and smiled at Mr. Caruso when he came in at 10:30 with his newspaper folded to the crossword. "You look tired," he said. "I'm always tired," she said. "You look a different kind of tired today." She gave him his coffee with 2 sugars and didn't answer. The morning was slow. The afternoon was average. She ran the numbers in her head between tables the way she always did, what she owed, what she had, what the gap between those 2 numbers meant in practical terms. The math hadn't changed overnight. $412. 6 days. She was wiping down the counter at 2 in the afternoon when Sal appeared beside her, moving with the particular deliberateness of a man who had been working up to saying something for several hours. "A man came in this morning," he said, "before you arrived." She set down the cloth. "What kind of man?" "The quiet kind. The kind that makes you want to answer questions you haven't been asked yet." Sal reached under the counter and produced a small white envelope. "He left this." She looked at the envelope. It had her name on it. Just her first name written in handwriting that was precise and controlled and somehow unsurprising. She opened it. Inside was a card, heavy paper, no logo, no letterhead. Just a phone number, and below it, 4 words. "When you're ready. M.B." She stood there for a moment. Sal was watching her with the expression of a man who was trying to decide between concern and resignation, and had not yet landed on either. "Elena," he said. "Don't," she said. "I'm just saying." "Sal." She looked at him. "Don't." He pressed his lips together. He picked up a glass and began polishing it, which was what he did when he had something to say and had decided not to say it. She had learned in 3 years that the polishing could last anywhere from 5 minutes to the rest of the shift. She put the card in her apron pocket. She went back to work. She told herself she wasn't going to call. She told herself that all the way through the dinner rush, through the last table, through closing, through the train ride home. She was very clear and very firm with herself about it, which was how she knew by the time she got off at her stop that she was going to call. Not because of the money, or not only because of the money, because of the thing she'd heard in his voice at 12:45 in the morning, asking a question he didn't need to ask, because of the weight in the old words, because she had spent 3 years carrying a language that nobody around her spoke, and for the first time since her grandmother died, she had heard it used the way her grandmother used it, not as decoration, not as nostalgia, but as the language you went back to when what you needed to say was too important for anything else. She dialed the number at 9 o'clock. He picked up on the second ring. "I didn't expect to hear from you this quickly." he said. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't going to call, she said. A brief silence. No, that's not something you do. Pretend, perform, he said. Most people perform. You don't. She sat down on her couch in her cold apartment and thought about how strange it was to be analyzed accurately by a man she had met 24 hours ago. What do you actually want from me, Mr. Bellini? She said. I told you, someone who understands the language. You have translators. I have people who translate words, he said. You translate meaning. She was quiet for a moment. What happened last night, the men you were angry with? What did they actually do? A pause. She expected him to deflect. He didn't. They made a deal without consulting me. A specific kind of deal with a specific kind of person. One who uses language in a very particular way says one thing means another, and the difference between the two is where the danger lives. He paused. They didn't catch it. I would have caught it, but I wasn't there. And you need someone who can catch it when you're not there. I need someone who hears what's underneath. She thought about her grandmother, who had been able to tell within 30 seconds of meeting someone whether they were honest, not by anything they said, by the way they chose their words, which ones they reached for, which ones they avoided the small architectures of deception that people built without knowing they were building them. I'm a waitress, she said again. You keep saying that. It keeps being true. Elena. The first time he'd used her first name, it landed differently than she expected, not familiar, not presumptuous. Careful, like he was aware of the weight of it. I'm not asking you to be anything you're not. I'm asking you to do what you already do. Listen, understand. Tell me what you hear. The silence stretched between them. How dangerous is this? She asked. Honest answer. Please. Moderately, he said. Less dangerous than you're imagining. More dangerous than I'd like it to be for you. She absorbed that. I need $412 by next Wednesday, she said. Silence. Then, done. That's not... I wasn't asking you to just... She stopped. I'm telling you that I'm in a position where I need to make choices based on money that I shouldn't have to make choices based on. I understand that, he said. $412. And a real number on top of it for your time. You tell me what's fair. I don't know what's fair in your world. Neither do most people who work for me, he said. At least you're honest about it. She looked at her grandmother's photograph across the room. I'm not working for you, she said finally. I'm advising you, temporarily, on the language. That's all. That's all, he agreed. And if I tell you I'm done, I'm done. Yes. You'll make sure of that. Elena. His voice was very even. I don't keep people who want to leave. It costs too much. She didn't know if she believed him, but she believed that he believed it, and for now, that would have to be enough. When? She said. Friday, he said. I'll send someone. She almost said I'll take the train. But something stopped her. Some instinct about the value of small resistances, about choosing which details to contest and which to let go. Fine, she said. Sleep, he said, and hung up. She set the phone down and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then she looked at her grandmother's photograph and said in Sicilian, I have either made the best decision of my life or the worst one. I genuinely cannot tell which. The photograph did not answer. It never did. But sometimes looking at it long enough, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice, sharp, practical, unimpressed by self-pity. You already made the decision, the voice would say. Stop asking questions about things that are already done. Elena smiled in spite of herself. She went to bed. Friday came faster than she expected. The days between were strange, ordinary on the surface. The same tables and the same coffee and the same calculations. But with something running underneath them, now a current she kept brushing against and then pulling away from. Sal watched her with the worried eyes of a man who had seen too many smart people make choices that made sense to them in the moment. She didn't explain herself to him. She didn't have the words yet for what she was doing, and she wouldn't lie to him with approximate words. The car came at noon on Friday. Not the kind of car she expected. Not black and expensive and obvious. A regular dark sedan, clean driven by a man in his 50s with a quiet face and excellent posture, and the particular bearing of someone who had been in the military or somewhere adjacent to it for many years. "Ms. Rossi," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "I'm Thomas," he said. "Mr. Bellini sent me." She got in. They drove for 20 minutes through Brooklyn, across a bridge she half knew, into a part of the city that was neither downtown nor residential, but somewhere in the deliberate middle, the kind of neighborhood that didn't advertise itself. They stopped at a building that looked like an accounting firm. She discovered when she went inside that it essentially was one. The lobby was clean and quiet and smelled like coffee and paper. A woman at the front desk nodded at Thomas and didn't look at Elena, which Elena filed away as interesting the deliberate non-looking of someone who had been instructed to be unobservant. She was shown into a conference room. Marco was already there, along with 3 other people, 2 men she didn't recognize, and a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of organized stillness that suggested she ran things. "Elena," Marco said. No preamble. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." She sat. She looked at the 3 people and waited. "These are people I trust," Marco said. "They're going to ask you some questions." She looked at him. "You didn't mention an interview." "It's not an interview," he said. "It's a conversation." "What's the difference?" "In a conversation, they're also trying to impress you," he said. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She turned to the 3 people and waited. The woman spoke first. Her name was Carla, and she asked Elena about her background, not personally, but professionally. What she understood about Sicilian dialect specifically. Where she'd learned. How much she'd kept up with it. Her questions were precise and quick, and Elena answered them in the same register. One of the men, young, sharp-faced, clearly skeptical, leaned forward halfway through and said in Sicilian something that was technically a question about her background, but was actually underneath an insult wrapped in professional language. He was testing whether she could hear the rapper and the content simultaneously. She answered him in Sicilian. She answered the question he'd asked. Then she answered the one he hadn't asked. Then she told him in the same even tone that she'd found the rapping somewhat transparent. The room went quiet. The young man looked at Marco. Marco looked at Elena with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. "That's enough," Marco said. "She's in." "Marco," the young man started. "She heard what you said and she answered what you meant. What else do you need?" Marco turned back to Elena. "We have a meeting next week. Victor Moretti. Old family, old habits, old language. He uses dialect specifically to exclude people from conversations. It's a power move, one he's been running for 30 years. My translator catches about 60% of it. The 40% he misses is always the part that matters." He paused. "I want you there." Elena thought about it. "As what?" "As my advisor, cultural consultant, whatever title you're comfortable with." "What will Moretti think I am?" Marco's expression didn't change. "He'll think you're nobody, that's the point." She absorbed that. "Tell me about him," she said. "Moretti, 62 years old, ran the waterfront for 22 years. His family came from the same region of Sicily as mine, different village, but close enough that the dialect overlaps in most places and diverges in the ones that matter. He believes I'm too young to hold what my father built. He believes that the way my father operated was the correct way, and that my methods are—" Marco paused, choosing the word carefully. "Naive." "Is he right?" The question came out before she had decided to ask it. She saw something move through the room. The woman Carla went very still. The young man's eyes cut sideways. Even Thomas, who was standing near the door, seemed to hold his breath. Marco looked at her for a long moment. "About which part?" he said. "The naive part." He considered this. The consideration was real. She could see him actually thinking about it, not performing thought. not buying time. No, he said. But I understand why he believes it. Why? Because the things I'm trying to do don't have precedent in his frame of reference. So from where he stands, they look like weakness. And from where you stand, from where I stand, Marco said, they look like the only way to survive the next 20 years without destroying everything my family built. She sat with that for a moment. Okay, she said. Okay, what? Okay, I'll be at the meeting with Moretti. She folded her hands on the table. But I need to understand what's actually at stake, not the surface of it, what's really underneath. Marco looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, small but visible, like someone adjusting the aperture of something and letting in a little more light. Moretti controls 3 loading facilities on the Eastern Dock. My family has an agreement with him that goes back 20 years. That agreement expires at the end of the year. He knows I want to renegotiate the terms. He's going to come to this meeting pretending to be willing to talk and actually working to gather information about what I know, what I don't know, and where he can find leverage. So he's not actually negotiating, he's scouting. Correct. And he thinks your translator only catches 60%. He knows it. He's been in meetings with my translator before. He's spent 3 years mapping exactly what the man misses. Elena understood then. He's going to give you 40% of the truth, in English, and he's going to say the other 60% in dialect out loud in the room because he's done this before and he knows your man won't catch it. Yes, that's elegant, she said, and then catching the expression on the young man's face. I don't mean I admire it, I mean it's been working, and he's confident it will keep working. Until now, Marco said. She looked at him. You're asking me to sit in that room and not react, to let him believe the whole conversation that nobody understands him, and then to tell you afterward everything. Yes. And in the moment, if he says something you need to respond to in real time, something where the timing matters. Marco held her gaze. That's why I need someone with discipline, not someone who'll react, someone who'll hold it until the right moment. She thought about the night in the restaurant, the man at the table who had made the dismissive comment. She had answered before she'd decided to answer. That was instinct, and instinct wasn't always discipline. She said so. You chose exactly the right moment, Marco said. You'd been listening for 40 minutes. You knew which thing was worth responding to and which things weren't. That's not instinct. That's judgment. She was quiet. I'll be there, she said. The meeting is Thursday. I work on Thursdays. I know. She waited. He said nothing else. She sighed. I'll talk to Sal. Your losses for the shift will be covered. It's not about money, she said. Sal worries. Tell him you have a second job opportunity. That's technically true, she said. Yes, Marco said. It is. She left that meeting with more information than she'd expected to have, and a clearer sense of what she was walking into. On the drive back, Thomas said nothing. She looked out the window and thought about Moretti. A man who had spent decades in a room believing he was the only one who understood what was being said. She knew something about being underestimated. She knew something about being in a room where the assumption was that you weren't fully present. She had spent 3 years at Nico's being invisible. It had turned out to be useful preparation. Tuesday came and went. Marco did not come into the restaurant that evening, but she found a second envelope from Thomas with a card inside. An amount of money that covered not just the rent, but the following month as well, and below it in that same controlled handwriting. Not payment. Logistics. The difference matters. She stared at that line for a long time. She couldn't decide if it was the most precisely thoughtful thing anyone had said to her in years, or if it was manipulation so good she couldn't see the seams. She decided it might be both. She deposited the money. She told herself she would sort out what she felt about it later. She called her friend Diane, who was the only person in her life who knew anything about what was happening, and told her a version of it that was accurate in all the factual details and completely inadequate to the emotional reality. Elena, Diane said. "Are you in danger?" "I don't think so." "That's not a no. Nothing in my life is guaranteed, Diane. The dry cleaner cut my hours. That was also not a no." "The dry cleaner didn't have bodyguards." "The dry cleaner had a nephew who borrowed money from his friends to buy the register. Different kind of problem." "Elena, I know what I'm doing," she said, and then more quietly, "I think I know what I'm doing." Diane was silent for a moment. "Call me after Thursday." "I will. Call me during Thursday if it goes wrong. If it goes that wrong, I might not be in a position to call." "Elena, that's not funny." "I know," she said. "I wasn't joking." Thursday arrived. She dressed carefully, not to impress, but to be invisible in the right way. Nothing that would read as trying. Nothing that would announce itself. The clothes she chose were good but unremarkable, the kind of thing you wore when you wanted people to look through you to the conversation happening around you. Thomas picked her up at 10. The location was different from the accounting firm. This was a private room in a restaurant in Manhattan, real Italian, the kind of place that had no menu posted outside and no sign visible from the street. The kind of place that existed entirely through knowing someone who knew someone. Marco was there when she arrived. He looked, if anything, slightly more controlled than usual. She was beginning to understand that his level of visible control was inversely proportional to the level of internal tension he was managing. "Moretti arrives in 20 minutes, he said. "Who else will be there?" "His 2 men. My 4. You and Carla." He paused. "Carla is there as administrative cover. You're there as—" "Nobody," Elena said. "Yes." "Where do I sit?" "End of the table, against the wall." She noted this. Against the wall meant outside the primary sight line. It meant Moretti would have to make a point of looking at her to see her, and men who wanted to believe they were the most important person in a room rarely made a point of looking at the edges. "What do I do with what I hear?" she said. "Write nothing. Remember everything." He looked at her. "Can you do that?" "Yes," she said. She believed it when she said it. What she didn't know yet, standing in that hallway 10 minutes before Victor Moretti walked through the door, was what she was about to hear, and what it would cost both of them to know it. Victor Moretti arrived exactly on time, which she later understood was itself a statement. Men like Moretti didn't arrive when they said they would arrive, unless they were making a point about precision, about control, about the kind of man who believed that time itself should answer to him. He was 62 and looked it the way certain men look their age, not diminished by it, but defined by it, the way stone is defined by weather. Heavy-set, deliberate in movement, with a face that had settled into permanent authority. He wore an older style of suit, the kind that signaled he did not follow trends because he did not need to. He walked in, shook Marco's hand, acknowledged Carla with a nod, and swept his eyes once across the rest of the table with the efficiency of a man cataloging the room. His eyes passed over Elena without stopping. She felt herself relax in a way she hadn't realized she was tense. They sat. The meeting began in English. For the first 20 minutes, it was cordial business. Language careful and measured, the kind of conversation that meant very little but needed to happen before the real conversation could. Elena sat at the end of the table, with her hands folded, and listened. And underneath the English, she listened for everything else, the pauses, the register shifts, the moments where one of Moretti's men leaned in slightly, and Moretti's shoulder moved by 2 degrees. She cataloged it all. At 23 minutes in the first shift happened. Moretti said something in English about the dock agreements, something routine, something expected. Then he turned to one of his men and said in Sicilian quickly, as if it were a throwaway side comment, "He doesn't know about the Eastern Gate." Elena heard it. She heard it and felt the information land in her chest like a stone dropping into water, and then she felt the rings spreading outward. What did it mean that there was something to know about an Eastern Gate, and that Moretti believed Marco didn't know it? She looked at the table. She gave nothing. Moretti continued in English. His man answered him in English. The conversation flowed forward and Elena let it flow while keeping that peace somewhere safe. Somewhere she could return to it. Then Moretti did something she hadn't anticipated. He looked at her directly. "Who is this?" he asked Marco, in English. "Cultural consultant," Marco said. Moretti studied her. She met his eyes and gave him exactly what someone gave a man like Moretti, who believed she was nobody, mild, polite attention. The face of someone present but not consequential. "How long have you worked with Marco?" he asked her, directly. "Not long," she said, in English with the accent of Brooklyn and not a trace of Sicily. Moretti smiled, not warmly. "You look familiar." "I have a common face," she said. He looked at her for one more beat. Then he turned back to Marco. In Sicilian, without any change in tone, as if commenting on the weather, he said to his man, "She's nobody, local girl. He's using her to look more approachable." Elena felt something hot move through her. Not anger, or not just anger. The particular sting of being dismissed by someone who didn't know what they were dismissing. She filed it. She kept her face exactly where it was. The meeting continued. And then, at the 40-minute mark, the real conversation began. It started with a shift in Moretti's posture, a settling the way someone settles when they believe they've assessed the room and found it safe. He began speaking in Sicilian more freely, and his man answered him in Sicilian, and the mix of languages in the room gave the impression of parallel conversations happening simultaneously. Marco's official translator, seated to Marco's right, was catching the surface. Elena could tell because she was watching the translator's face, and his face registered the things he understood and moved past the things he didn't. She counted the gaps. The gaps were where Moretti lived. What Moretti said in Sicilian over the course of the next 30 minutes was this: he had no intention of renegotiating the terms of the agreement. He was here to buy time. He had already made a private arrangement with the family from New Jersey, the Carbone family whom Marco knew and had publicly described as unstable, to transfer control of 2 of the 3 dock facilities before the end of the year. The third he planned to keep not for its value, but because holding it gave him leverage over Marco's import channels. He said this the way someone says things when they believe they are alone in a room. He said it with the ease of a man who had done this before and never been heard. Elena held every word. She held it the way you hold something hot, carefully, completely aware of it at every moment. At one point, Moretti said in Sicilian something that made her go very still inside. He said, "The boy's father understood fear. The boy understands nothing. He will be gone within 2 years." And then after a pause, his man said, "What about the girl?" And Moretti said, "Forget the girl." She breathed evenly. She looked at the table. She did not move. The meeting ended 45 minutes after it began. Handshakes. English. The performance of progress. Moretti left first. The room held its shape for a moment after he walked out. Then Marco looked at Elena. His eyes asked the question before his mouth did. She looked at him, and in that moment she made a decision about the order in which she would give him the information, what first, what second, what last. Because the last thing was the thing she needed him to hear clearly, and she needed everything else out of the way first. "He's already made a deal with the Carbone family," she said. 2 facilities transferred before December. He's keeping the 3rd for leverage on your import channel. The room went very quiet. Marco's expression did not change, but something behind it did a recalibration fast, and complete the way a man recalculates when the ground he was standing on turns out to be different from what he thought. "He's known about this meeting for 3 weeks, she continued. "He came here to make you believe negotiation was possible. The real purpose was to assess what you know." One of Marco's men exhaled a sharp sound, almost involuntary. "There's more," she said. Marco held her gaze. "He believes you don't know about something called the Eastern Gate," she said. "I don't know what it is. But whatever it is, the fact that he thinks you don't know it matters to him." Marco was still. The stillness was not the stillness of someone who was confused. It was the stillness of someone who had just received a piece of information that completed a picture they'd been looking at for a long time. "Anything else?" he said. She held his gaze. He said you'll be gone within 2 years, she said. And he said, she paused, to forget about me. The room was completely silent. Then Marco said quietly to the man on his right, "Get me everything on the eastern gate. Tonight." He looked at Elena. She couldn't read his expression. She had been reading people her whole life. It was the thing she was good at, the thing her grandmother had given her, along with the language, and this man gave her less than anyone she'd ever tried to read. "You held that the entire meeting," he said. "You asked me to." "I know." He looked at her for a long moment. "How did you keep your face like that?" She thought about it. About 14-hour shifts and landlords who didn't call back, and dry cleaners who gave your hours to their nephews, and all the practice life had given her in keeping her reaction on the inside while the world continued on the outside. "Practice," she said. Marco nodded slowly. Something in his expression, something she hadn't seen before, not in the restaurant, and not in the phone call, and not in the conference room at the accounting firm, settled into place. Not gratitude exactly. Something larger than gratitude and harder to name. He looked at her the way someone looks at a person, when they realized the category they had filed them under was the wrong category entirely. "Elena," he said. "Yes. You understand what you just did." "I translated a conversation." "No," he said. "You changed the shape of the next 6 months of my life." She thought about that, about the weight of it. "Then you probably owe me a raise," she said, and for the second time since she'd known him, Marco Bellini almost smiled. Outside, the city moved through its afternoon, with the complete indifference of cities everywhere, to the small, significant things happening inside them. Inside this room, something had shifted. Not just in what Marco knew, in what Elena understood about herself. She had walked into a room full of powerful men who had looked straight through her, and she had heard everything. The Eastern Gate was a door that nobody was supposed to know existed. Marco didn't sleep that night. Elena knew this, not because he told her, but because he called her at 2 in the morning, not to talk, not to ask anything specific, but to say, "The Eastern Gate is a secondary access point to the dock facilities. My father built it in 1987. Nobody outside the original construction crew was supposed to know about it. The construction crew is all dead or gone." She was sitting up in bed in the dark. "And Moretti knows. Moretti knows." A pause. "Which means someone told him. Someone who was never supposed to be able to tell him, because they were never supposed to know." She let that sit for a moment. "How many people in your organization knew about it?" "Before tonight, I would have said 3, including me. And now I don't know what I would say." His voice was completely flat. Not angry. Something past anger. Something that had burned through anger and come out the other side as pure, cold clarity. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll talk tomorrow." He hung up. She sat in the dark and thought about what it meant to discover that someone inside your own walls had been feeding information to the outside. She thought about the particular loneliness of that kind of betrayal, not the kind that came from enemies which you could prepare for, but the kind that came from the people you'd chosen to trust. Her grandmother had said once in Sicilian that the wound from a stranger heals faster because it has a clean edge. The wound from someone you love is jagged. It takes longer. It leaves a worse scar. She thought Marco Bellini was learning the truth of that tonight. She didn't sleep well either. In the morning, she went to Nico's and worked her shift and said nothing to Sal, who watched her with the careful eyes of a man who had stopped asking questions and started just watching. Around 2 in the afternoon, her phone buzzed. "Come tonight, 7 o'clock. Thomas will pick you up. MB." She showed up at 7. This time the location was different again. A private floor above a building in Red Hook that she would later understand was the actual center of things, not the accounting firm, not the Manhattan restaurant, but this place, which had the atmosphere of a command center that had never advertised itself as one. The furniture was functional. The walls had nothing decorative on them. There were more people here than she'd seen before, men moving between rooms with the purposefulness of people who had been given specific problems to solve and were currently solving them. Marco was at the center of it. He looked, she noted, like a man who had not slept and had decided that sleep was a variable he could eliminate temporarily without significant consequence. His control was intact. But she was learning to read the spaces between his control, and the spaces were tighter tonight. Compressed under pressure, the way a structure compresses under load. He brought her into a side room. Carla was there. The young, sharp-faced man from the first meeting. His name was Nico, same as the restaurant, which she found darkly amusing. Was there, plus two men she didn't recognize, who had the specific bearing of people who handled information for a living. "We've identified the source," Marco said without preamble the moment she sat down. She waited. "His name is Dario Sena. He's been with the organization for 11 years. He managed logistics for the waterfront accounts, which means he had access to the original dock documentation, including the Eastern Gate schematics. He's been feeding information to Moretti's people for at least 8 months." Elena absorbed this. 11 years. 8 months of betrayal inside 11 years of apparent loyalty. "What are you going to do?" she asked. The room went slightly still. She understood from the quality of the stillness that this was perhaps not the question people usually asked Marco Bellini directly. They usually waited to be told, not asked. Marco looked at her. "What would you do?" She thought about it honestly, not reaching for an answer that would sound right, but sitting with the actual question. "I'd want to know why before I decided anything else, because the why determines everything." "Why do you think that?" "Because if he's desperate money family problem, something that put him in a corner, that's one thing. If he's been loyal to Moretti longer than he's been loyal to you, and the 11 years were the performance, that's another thing entirely. The action looks the same from the outside. The meaning is completely different." Carla across the table made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. Elena glanced at her and caught something in her expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition. The look of someone hearing a thought they'd had themselves articulated by someone else. "Dario is in a room downstairs," Marco said. "He's been there since this morning." She felt the weight of that. "He knows, you know. He suspects. He doesn't know how much. And you want to—" She stopped. Reorganize the question. "What do you need from me specifically?" "I'm going to speak with him," Marco said. "I want you there." "Why?" "Because Dario's mother is Sicilian, first generation. He grew up speaking it at home the way you did. When people are under pressure, real pressure, the kind where they're not thinking about performance anymore, they go back to the first language, the one they learned before they learned to lie in English." He paused. "I want to know what he says when he stops performing." She looked at him for a long moment. "You want me to watch him, not translate. Watch." "Yes. And if I hear something you can't, tell me." She thought about the restaurant, about 14-hour shifts and what happened to a person's filters after hour 10, when the performance cost too much and you just moved on automatic. She thought about how much you could see in a person when they were past the point of managing their image. She thought about what she was being asked to do, and what it meant, and whether she could do it. "Okay," she said. Dario Sena was a man in his mid-40s, with the specific appearance of someone who had been handsome once, and had let it erode through stress and bad decisions, and the particular weight of living with something they shouldn't be living with. He was sitting at a table when they came in. Not restrained, she noted, which itself was a statement about the kind of operation Marco ran or wanted to run. He looked up when Marco walked in, and then his eyes moved to Elena and she saw something flicker in them. Confusion, primarily the confusion of a man trying to calculate what her presence meant. Marco sat down across from him. Elena positioned herself to the side, slightly behind Marco's sightline, visible but not central, the same position she'd occupied at the Moretti meeting. The position of someone who might or might not matter. "Dario," Marco said, in English. Calm even. "Marco." Dario's voice was careful, not quite steady. "Tell me about the Eastern Gate." 3 words. 1 sentence. The directness of it landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Dario went very still. "I don't," he started. "Dario." Marco's voice didn't change. Not louder, not harder, just present. Fully, completely present in the way that made you understand that there was nowhere else this man's attention was, and nowhere it was going. "Don't." Silence. And then Dario did something Elena had been watching for without knowing she was watching for it. He looked at the table. His lips moved very slightly. He was saying something to himself too quiet to hear, and in English it would have been inaudible. But it wasn't English. It was Sicilian, the specific variant of a man who had learned it from a Sicilian mother in a small apartment, the variant that carried in it the sound of kitchens and arguments and prayers, said under breath. He was saying, "God forgive me. God forgive me. God forgive me." She felt something shift in her chest. Not pity exactly. Something more complicated, the recognition of a man who had made a choice he couldn't unmake and was now sitting inside the full weight of it for the first time. She looked at Marco. She didn't speak. She made a very small motion with her hand, the gesture her grandmother used when she wanted to say wait. "Give it a moment. Let it breathe." Marco saw it. He sat back by half an inch. He waited. The silence expanded, and Dario broke. Not in a dramatic way. Not with tears or raised voices. He broke the way old structures break quietly from the inside, the support giving out before anything on the surface changed. "He has my brother," Dario said. In English, barely above a whisper. The room held its breath. "Moretti, he has my brother, Paolo. He's been—" Dario stopped. His voice was doing something that voices did when the body was in genuine distress and trying to keep operating through it. Paolo borrowed money from people connected to Moretti's network 3 years ago. He couldn't pay, and Moretti found out I worked for you, and he stopped again. Marco said nothing. 8 months ago, Dario said. Moretti's man came to my apartment. He told me Paolo was being held. He told me what he needed from me. He told me that every piece of information I gave them bought Paolo more time. He put his face in his hands briefly, and then pulled them away, the gesture of a man who couldn't afford to stop seeing clearly even when he wanted to. I tried to give them things that were small enough not to matter. Things that were already, he looked up, things I thought couldn't hurt you. The Eastern Gate is not a small thing, Marco said. I know. Dario's voice dropped to nothing. I know. They pushed. They kept pushing. And I kept thinking I thought if I could just buy enough time. Where is Paolo now? Marco said. Dario looked at him with the face of someone who had stopped expecting anything good, and had therefore stopped being able to process it when something good happened. What? Your brother. Where is he? I only know he's somewhere in New Jersey, one of the Moretti facilities near. Give Nico the details you have, Marco said. Everything you know. Location, time frame, the man who came to your apartment, every name, every date. Dario stared at him. Marco, I'm not done being angry with you, Marco said very evenly. I want to be clear about that. You put things at risk that I cannot fully calculate yet. We're going to have a different conversation about this later, and it's not going to be comfortable for either of us. He paused. But I'm not going to leave your brother in a room somewhere in New Jersey. Give Nico the information. Dario looked at the table. His jaw moved. Whatever he was holding together was barely holding. Thank you, he said. The words came out stripped of everything except the plain meaning. Marco stood. He looked at Elena. Come with me. They left Dario with Nico and walked out into the corridor, and Marco kept walking until they were in a small room at the end of the hall, and he closed the door, and then he stood there for a moment with his back to her. She waited. His brother? He said finally. Yes. Moretti used his brother. Yes. He turned around. His face was controlled, but the spaces between his control were wider than she had ever seen them. Something was working behind his eyes that he was not trying to hide from her, and she understood this as significant, that he had chosen in this particular room, with this particular person, not to perform composure. "If I had done what my father would have done," Marco said, "I would have walked in there and not asked a single question before." He stopped. Let the sentence end without finishing it, which told her everything the ending would have said. "But you asked," she said. "I asked because you were in the room." She held that for a moment. "You would have asked anyway." "Maybe." He moved to the window. "Maybe not." "Marco." He looked at her. "You asked because it's who you are," she said. "Not because I was there. I was there because of who you are." He was quiet for a long time. "The Eastern Gate," he said. "Moretti's been there. Or his people have. Which means he's been moving things through a channel he shouldn't know exists. Which means what I thought was a renegotiation situation is actually a..." He stopped, his jaw set. "He's not trying to renegotiate. He's already positioned to take everything. The meeting last week was theater." "The whole meeting," she said. "The whole thing." She thought about Moretti's face across the table. The settled ease of him. The way he'd looked at her and seen nobody, and she had heard everything. "He made a mistake," she said. "He made several. No, one mistake. One fundamental mistake." She looked at Marco. "He's been operating on the assumption that the language is a wall. That speaking Sicilian in a room full of people who don't understand it is the same as being in a private room. He's been making decisions based on that assumption for 30 years. And now it's wrong. It's been wrong since Tuesday night at 9 o'clock in a restaurant in Brooklyn," she said. Something moved across Marco's face. She couldn't name it exactly. It was in the territory of recognition, but the kind of recognition that went in two directions at once, backward and forward simultaneously, like understanding something about the past and the future at the same time. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "Your grandmother's village," he said. "Outside Agrigento." "Yes." "My grandfather's village was 4 miles from there." She went completely still. The dialect is specific enough that two people from different villages would speak it slightly differently. But 4 miles. He paused. 4 miles is close enough that the variant would be nearly identical. She understood what he was saying. She understood it in her body, before her mind had fully processed it, the way certain things registered in the old pre-language part of the brain, in the place where recognitions happened before they had names. "That's why you looked at me that way," she said. "In the restaurant, when I said my grandmother was from near Agrigento." "Yes. You recognize something." "I recognize the specific sound of a place," he said. "I hadn't heard it in 20 years. Not since my grandfather died." She thought about her grandmother, about the years of evenings with the old woman learning a language that felt like learning a secret. She had always assumed it was a private thing, her grandmother's private preservation of a private place. She had not imagined that someone else in Brooklyn was carrying the same village in their voice. "Did you know," she said, "when you came back to the restaurant when you called at 12:45, did you already know about the villages?" "No," he said. "I looked it up the next morning." "And then what did you think?" He looked at her steadily. "I thought the world was stranger than I gave it credit for." She let out a breath. "That's not wrong." "No," he said. "It's not." The silence that followed was different from all the silences she had catalogued between them, different from the dangerous one in the restaurant, different from the calculating one in the conference room, different from the controlled one in the Manhattan meeting room. This one was quiet in the way something is quiet when it has settled into its own shape and stopped trying to be anything else. "There's still Moretti," she said. "There's still Moretti," he agreed. "He doesn't know that you know what you know." "No." "Which means you have a window," she said. "A short one. Before he moves on the Carbone deal, before he makes the Eastern Gate situation official, before any of this becomes irreversible." "Yes." "What are you going to do with it?" He looked at her for a long moment. The question moved through him in a way she could see, not the way simple decisions moved through people, but the way complex ones did, the kind that had ramifications that extended in multiple directions and had to be traced out before any of them could be chosen. "I'm going to do something my father would have called stupid," he said. "What's that?" "I'm going to meet with Moretti again, this week. And instead of playing the game he expects me to play, I'm going to show him exactly how much I know." She considered this. "That's a risk." "Yes. If you show him you know about the Carbone deal, he'll know he has a leak. He already suspects he has a leak. Dario wasn't the only one feeding information, he just didn't know that. Moretti's been operating under the assumption that information flows are messy and some of what he says gets back to me. He's been managing that assumption." He paused. "What he hasn't been managing for is a room where everything he says in Sicilian gets heard." She followed his thinking. "He doesn't know what the specific leak is, so you can use the information in a way that doesn't reveal the source." "More than that," Marco said. "I can use it in a way that makes him believe someone in his own organization gave it up." She sat with that. "That's elegant." "It's necessary," he said. "Elegant is a bonus." She almost smiled. "When is the meeting?" "Friday. He doesn't know yet. He will by tomorrow morning." "Does he have to agree?" Marco looked at her with an expression that reminded her briefly of the first night in the restaurant. The particular look of someone encountering a question they found more amusing than they expected. "Victor Moretti will agree," he said, "because I'm going to phrase it in a way that makes declining an admission of what he's been doing." "In English or Sicilian?" "English," he said. "The message needs to be perfectly clear." She nodded. "And Friday, you want me there." "Friday." He said, "You are essential." She absorbed that word. Essential. Not useful, not helpful, not good to have in the room. Essential. She thought about the dry cleaner who had given her hours to his nephew. She thought about $412 and 6 days and a radiator that knocked twice and gave up. She thought about her grandmother who had told her on one of the last evenings before the end. The thing you carry without knowing you're carrying it, that's the thing that will matter someday. She had thought her grandmother was talking about resilience, about the practice of continuing. She understood now that she had been talking about language. "Okay," Elena said. "Friday." Marco nodded. He moved toward the door, and then he stopped. "The village," he said. He didn't turn around when he said it. "My grandfather used to say that people from there were born with the ability to hear what wasn't being said. He said it was something in the air of the place, something that got into you." She thought about that. "My grandmother said something similar," she said. "She said the village taught you to listen before you learned to talk, that the mountains were so quiet, you had to listen carefully just to know you were alive." He was quiet for a moment. "Same mountains," he said. "Same mountains," she agreed. He left. She sat in the quiet room for a little while after he was gone. She thought about Friday, about Victor Moretti, about the specific way information could become power when it was held by the right person at the right moment. She thought about what Marco had said, that showing Moretti what he knew was something his father would have called stupid. She thought about what his father would have done instead. She thought about the difference between those two paths and where they ended up. And then she picked up her phone and called Diane. "Still alive?" she said when Diane answered. "Elena, what happened?" It's the sound of Diane looking at a clock. "It's 9:45. "I know, I'm sorry, I just wanted to—" She stopped, tried to figure out what she'd actually called to say. "I wanted to tell someone. Something that I can't fully explain yet." "Tell me what you can." She thought about it, about the village 4 miles apart, about the same mountains, about a language carried across an ocean by 2 different families and handed down to 2 different grandchildren who had ended up 30 years later in a restaurant in Brooklyn at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night. "You know how sometimes," she said, "you think you ended up somewhere by accident, and then later you realize there might not be such a thing as accident." "Elena?" Diane's voice was careful. "Are you okay?" "I think so," she said. And then, because she was trying to be honest, I'm doing something that matters. I don't know what it costs yet, but it matters. Diane was quiet for a moment. Your grandmother would have an opinion about this. She would have 6 opinions, Elena said, loudly. Would they be good opinions? She thought about her grandmother, about the sharp face and the enormous dark eyes and the hands that had done too much work, and the voice that had said the thing you carry without knowing you're carrying it, that's the thing that will matter someday. Yes, she said. I think they would be. She got home late. She didn't sleep much. Her mind kept running the variables of Friday, the shape of what was coming, the things she knew that Moretti didn't know she knew. She kept turning the chessboard in her head, trying to see it from every angle. At some point after midnight, she stopped trying and just lay in the dark. She thought about Marco sitting in a building in Red Hook, making decisions that would shape the next 6 months of his world. She thought about him at the age of 7 being told by his grandfather that reaction was what separated builders from breakers. She thought about carrying that for 30 years of trying to build something differently from the way everything around you was built, with people on every side who didn't believe you could. She understood that kind of loneliness. She understood it the way you understood something you'd lived through yourself. She closed her eyes. Friday was 3 days away. 3 days in which Moretti would believe he was the most informed man in the room, would finalize his plans with the Carbone family, would settle further into the certainty that the boy who didn't understand fear was about to lose everything his father had left him. 3 days in which he would be wrong, and would not yet know it. She set her alarm. She went to work in the morning. She carried what she knew the way her grandmother had taught her to carry things quietly with both hands, without letting it show on her face. And somewhere on the other side of those 3 days, in a private room in this city that was built on the secrets people kept from each other, Victor Moretti was going to sit across a table and realize that the language he had used as a wall for 30 years had become, without his knowing it, a door. And Elena Rossi, the waitress from Brooklyn, who was nobody, the girl from a forgotten neighborhood, the woman who answered in her grandmother's voice, was the one who had opened it. Friday came in cold. Elena felt it the moment she stepped outside, a sharp November wind off the water that cut straight through the coat she'd owned for 4 years, and reminded her, as it did every fall, that she needed a better one. She stood on the sidewalk outside her building for exactly 30 seconds, feeling the cold. And then Thomas pulled up in the dark sedan, and she got in, and the door closed, and she left the cold outside. Neither of them spoke on the drive. Thomas had a quality she had come to appreciate over the past 2 weeks. He understood the difference between silence that needed filling and silence that needed protecting. This was the second kind. She was running the meeting in her head, the variables, the order of information, the moment when Marco would shift from English to something else, and what that shift would cost Moretti the ability to pretend. She had slept 4 hours. It was enough. It would have to be. Marco was already at the location when she arrived, a different private room this time, in a building in Lower Manhattan that had the legal face of a consulting firm and the actual function of a place where powerful people said things they couldn't say anywhere else. She had stopped being surprised by these locations. She had started cataloging what they had in common rooms, with one exit visible and at least one more that wasn't tables positioned, so that whoever sat with their back to the wall could see the door, a particular quality of acoustic absorption in the walls that meant conversations stayed where they were put. Marco was standing when she walked in. Not pacing, he wasn't a pacer, she had learned. He stood the way he always stood, which was with the stillness of someone who had chosen to be still rather than arrived at it by default. But today, the stillness had a different quality. It was the stillness of something coiled. "You didn't sleep?" she said. He looked at her. "Neither did you." "I slept 4 hours." "I slept 2, he said, "which means I have 2 hours of advantages over you." She looked at him for a moment. "That's the closest thing to a joke I've heard from you. Don't get used to it." But the corner of his mouth moved, that almost movement she had catalogued exactly 3 times now, each time more visible than the last. "He arrives in 40 minutes. "Who else is in the room?" Danny, Carla. Two of Moretti's men will come with him, which he'll frame as standard security, and which is actually a statement about how seriously he takes this meeting relative to how seriously he wants me to think he takes it. He paused. And you? Same position as last time. No. He said it without hesitation. This time you sit beside me. She registered the shift. Beside him, not at the edge. Visible. Intentional. He'll notice that, she said. That's the point. She understood then. You want him off balance from the moment he sits down. Moretti has spent 30 years controlling rooms, Marco said. He controls them by understanding exactly what every element means before he walks in. Last time I gave him an easy read on you. This time I'm giving him something he'll have to keep reassessing. He looked at her. You sat in his room for 45 minutes, and he never once felt the floor move under him. Today I want him to feel it from the first minute. And if he asks who I am, tell him. She blinked. Everything. Your name, your background, your grandmother. Marco held her gaze. Not what you do for me, just who you are. Let him build his own theory. He'll underestimate me again. Yes, Marco said. And this time he'll know it when it happens. She sat with the geometry of it. The particular cruelty of letting someone watch themselves make the mistake they were making. The difference between that and simply outmaneuvering someone in the dark. You want him to see it, she said. I want him to understand what happened in that room last week, Marco said. Not just feel the consequences, understand them. Why does that matter to you? The question landed, and he took it seriously, the way she had come to understand. He took everything she asked seriously, not performatively, not because he was trying to seem thoughtful, but because the questions she asked were the kind that had real answers, and he respected the effort required to find them. Because my father's version of this would have been to punish him without explanation, Marco said. And the men my father punished without explanation went away angry and afraid and became problems later, or their sons did. He paused. I want Moretti to go away understanding. A man who understands what happened can make a different choice. A man who only knows he was hurt doesn't have that option. She thought about that for a long time. Your father would have called that naive, she said. My father called everything I believe naive, Marco said. He's been wrong about most of it, not all of it, but most. Carla appeared in the doorway. He's early. Car just pulled up. The room contracted. Elena felt it, the particular shift in air quality that happened when something moved from preparation to reality. Marco straightened. Not visibly, there was nothing to see, but she felt him settle into a version of himself that was final, the way a door settles when it's fully closed. Ready? He said. Yes, she said. Victor Moretti walked in exactly the way she had expected, with the certainty of a man arriving at something he had already decided he controlled. He had two men with him. He was wearing the same style of suit as last time, which she now understood was not about fashion, but about identity. The suit was a statement that he had been the same man for 40 years and intended to remain so. He looked at the table. He looked at Elena sitting beside Marco. Something moved across his face, fast, quickly suppressed, but there, a recalculation. The expression of someone who had walked into a room expecting a particular arrangement of furniture and found one piece in the wrong place. Marco, he said in English. He shook Marco's hand. His eyes came back to Elena. Victor, Marco said. You remember Elena? The consultant, Moretti said. Not quite a question. She's more than that, Marco said, and said nothing further. Moretti sat. His two men settled behind him. He looked at Elena with the reassessing eyes of a man who had misjudged something once and was trying to determine how much it mattered. Ms. He began in English. Rossi, she said. Elena Rossi. My grandmother was from a village outside Agrigento. She came over in 1962. She raised me speaking the language of that village because she said it was the only way she still felt at home. She said it simply without emphasis, the way you said things that were just facts. You might know the area. I understand your family's village was nearby." The silence that followed was exquisite. She watched Moretti's face do something she would describe later to Diane as a controlled implosion. The surface held perfectly, but something behind it collapsed rapidly and completely, and she could see him rebuilding in real time, trying to understand how much she had just told him about what she knew and when she knew it. "Is that right?" he said. Not a question. "Small world," she said. Moretti looked at Marco. "You've been doing research." "I'm always doing research," Marco said mildly. "Coffee, Victor." The meeting that followed was the most precisely constructed 40 minutes Elena had ever witnessed. Marco moved through it with a quality she could only describe as surgical patience, cutting exactly where he intended to cut, at exactly the pace he intended, with no wasted motion. He spoke in English. He discussed the dock agreements with the same surface reasonableness Moretti had brought to their first meeting, and Moretti responded with the same surface reasonableness, and underneath the surface, the real conversation was happening at a completely different speed. At the 12-minute mark, Marco said very casually, "I was looking at the Eastern Dock documentation this week. The older files, from 87 and 88. Moretti's coffee cup stopped 1 centimeter from the table. Elena heard it, the microscopic hesitation, before it set down the tiny auditory evidence of a hand that had received a signal from a brain that had just registered something it hadn't expected. "Interesting period," Moretti said. "Even. Controlled. Very," Marco said. "My father built some things during that time that I didn't fully know about until recently. It's useful to understand the complete picture of what you've inherited." Moretti looked at him. "Of course." "For instance," Marco said, "the secondary access point, the Eastern Gate." The room was completely still. And then Moretti did something that Elena had not expected. He smiled. It was a slow smile, the kind that moved from calculation rather than warmth, and it said, "I see. So, we're doing this." "Your father was a thorough man," Moretti said. "He was," Marco agreed. "Though I find myself disagreeing with some of his methods. Not his instincts, just the methods." "The young often do," Moretti said. There was something in his tone now, the particular condescension of a man who had decided that directness was being offered, and he was going to meet it with directness of his own. "Until they understand why the methods existed." "Tell me why they existed," Marco said. Genuinely. The sincerity of it was almost disarming. He wasn't being provocative, he was actually asking. Moretti looked at him for a moment, recalibrating again. "Because people don't respond to reason, Marco. They respond to certainty, and the methods created certainty." "In the short term," Marco said. "Long enough," Moretti said. "Your arrangement with the Carbone family, is that long enough?" Marco said it in the same tone as everything else. Conversational, like a man asking about the weather. The smile left Moretti's face. For the first time in the meeting, the 62-year-old man who had controlled the waterfront for 22 years looked at Marco Bellini without any performance at all. What Elena saw underneath was not what she had expected. She had expected anger. She had expected threat or bluster, or the particular cold calculation of a man who had been caught doing something and was now weighing his options. What she saw instead was something that surprised her completely. Exhaustion. Real deep structural exhaustion. The kind that came not from a bad week, but from years of a particular kind of effort. Years of holding something up that kept getting heavier and never got lighter. She looked at her hands for a moment to give him the space to reassemble. Then she heard something she hadn't expected to hear. Moretti said something in Sicilian, under his breath. Not directed at his men. Not directed at anyone in the room, really. The way people said things in their first language when they had gone past the point of remembering to perform. He said, "I'm so tired of all of this." She kept her face exactly where it was. She did not look at Marco, but she felt him beside her with the peripheral awareness she had developed over these weeks. The sensitivity to the small physical signals of a man who kept most of himself below the surface, and she felt him hear it too. Marco spoke. In Sicilian. Quiet. Not aggressive. Then stop, he said. Moretti looked up sharply. The two men behind him tensed simultaneously. Danny across the table went very still. Carla's pen stopped moving. Marco had just admitted in Sicilian in this room that he understood everything. The admission was enormous. It was the thing he had been holding back, the card that once played could not be unplayed. He was showing Moretti the full extent of what Elena had given him, not just the information, but the mechanism. The door that had been open the whole time. Moretti stared at him. He looked at Elena. She met his eyes. She didn't apologize with her expression. She didn't gloat either. She simply looked at him the way she had looked at him across the table at the first meeting, with the steady regard of someone who was completely present and completely honest. You, Moretti said. In English. Just the word. Yes, she said. The whole time. The whole time, she said. He looked back at Marco. Something was happening in his face, a process of recalibration so fundamental that it was visible the way tectonic shifts are occasionally visible on the surface. He was not just recalculating the meeting. He was recalculating the last several weeks, possibly longer. What do you want? Moretti said finally. Back in English. The choice of English was itself a surrender of sorts, an acknowledgement that the Sicilian as a private channel was finished. I want to tell you something first, Marco said, and I want you to hear it before we talk about what comes next. Moretti waited. You built something real, Marco said. 22 years on the waterfront. My father respected you, which he did not do easily. You kept your agreements, including the ones that didn't benefit you, which most men in this business don't do. He paused. What you're trying to do now, the Carbone arrangement, the Eastern Gate, the plan to make yourself indispensable before the agreement expires, I understand why you're doing it. You look at me, and you see someone who is going to dismantle everything, including the things you built. Moretti said nothing. You're not wrong that I'm going to change things, Marco said. But you're wrong about what that means for what you built. Pretty words, Moretti said. And the words were dismissive, but the voice under them was something else, something that wanted cautiously to consider the possibility that they were something more than pretty. Give me the Carbone arrangement, Marco said. Cancel it before it's finalized. I know it's not final yet, you have until the 15th. Cancel it, and we renegotiate the dock agreement on terms that give you a meaningful stake in what I'm building, not a subordinate position, a partner's position. The word landed in the room. Moretti looked at it like a man looking at something he wasn't sure was real. Partners, he said. The word means something to me, Marco said. My father never used it because he never meant it. I mean it. Why would you? Moretti stopped, started again. You have what you need. You know about the Eastern Gate. You know about the Carbone deal. You could walk away from this table and I would have no leverage. Yes, Marco said. So why offer partnership? Because I could walk away with no leverage situation and a 62-year-old enemy who has 22 years of connections and nothing left to lose. Marco held his gaze. Or I could walk away with someone who knows the waterfront better than anyone alive and has decided to be useful rather than dangerous. He let that sit for a moment. I'm choosing the second one. The silence that followed was the longest of the meeting. Elena counted it. 15 seconds. For a man like Moretti, 15 seconds of open silence in a negotiation was not silence. It was seismic. Then Moretti looked at her. What do you think? He said. He asked her. Directly. She was surprised enough that she took half a second before answering. I think you already know what you want to do, she said. I think you came into this meeting exhausted, and you came into the last one exhausted, and you've been exhausted for a while. I think the Carbone arrangement isn't something you want. It's something you felt you had to do. Moretti's jaw tightened. And I think, she said more quietly, that a man who didn't want to do the thing he felt he had to do is a man who might want the alternative if the alternative is real. And is it? Moretti asked. He was asking Marco, but he was looking at her. Ask him, she said. You know how to read a man who means what he says. You've been doing it for 40 years. Moretti looked at Marco for a long moment. Marco looked back. He didn't push. He didn't add anything. He had said what he had to say, and now he was simply present, which was Elena had come to understand one of the most powerful things he did, the ability to be fully there without reaching. I'll cancel the Carbone call this afternoon, Moretti said. Something released in the room, not dramatically but like a held breath, let out slowly. Good, Marco said. The terms of the renegotiation. Carla has a draft, Marco said. It's a starting point, not a final offer. I expect you to push back on several things. That's the point. For the first time, Moretti looked at Marco with something that was not assessment or suspicion or the careful measurement of a potential adversary. He looked at him the way you looked at someone when you were deciding whether to trust them, and the answer was landing slowly and without full certainty on yes. Your father would not recognize you, Moretti said. I know, Marco said. I'm not trying to be him. No, Moretti said. You're trying to be something harder. He picked up his coffee. Something that doesn't have a name yet in this business. Give it time, Marco said. When Moretti left, he left differently from how he had arrived. Same stride, same suit. But something in the carriage of his shoulders had shifted slightly higher actually, which she would think about later, the way people carry themselves differently when they have put something down. The room held its silence for a moment after his footsteps faded. Then Danny said in a tone that suggested he was recalibrating everything he thought he knew about how the world worked. He actually took it. Yes, Marco said. I didn't think he would take it. I know, Marco said. That's why I didn't ask you. Danny looked at Elena. She could not read his exact expression, but it was in the neighborhood of reluctant respect, the particular expression of a man who had spent weeks being skeptical about something, and was now in the position of having the skepticism made to look foolish in front of witnesses. The thing you said, Danny said, about him knowing he wanted to do it. How did you know that? Elena thought about her grandmother, who could read a person's real feeling in 30 seconds. She thought about 3 years of carrying $400 rent shortfalls and 14-hour shifts and practicing the particular art of knowing what someone was going to do before they did it, because in her world, the difference between those two things was whether you had a job tomorrow. I watch people, she said. It's what I do. You're going to be very bad for my career, Danny said. But he said it without heat, and when she looked at him, she saw that the thing in his expression had completed its movement from skepticism to something that grudgingly acknowledged her. She almost said something. She decided not to. She let it be what it was. Marco was standing by the window. He had his back to the room, which she had learned was the position he took when he was processing something that required more interior space than a face-forward stance allowed. She walked over and stood beside him. You didn't plan to offer partnership, she said. It wasn't a question. No, he said. What changed? He was quiet for a moment. He said he was tired. She hadn't known he'd heard it. The Sicilian, the underbreath words, the thing Moretti hadn't meant to say out loud. She looked at his profile. You understood that, she said. I understood it exactly, Marco said. Because I say it to myself most mornings. He turned slightly, not quite looking at her directly. Tired of the game as it exists. Tired of the version of winning that looks like everyone around you becoming afraid of you. He paused. I thought if he's tired enough to say it out loud, even accidentally, even in Sicilian, then maybe he's ready to do something different. She thought about his father. About the empire built on fear. About the weight of inheriting a world you didn't make and were trying to change from the inside without destroying the people inside it. Your father's version of this meeting ends differently, she said. My father's version of this meeting doesn't happen, Marco said. He would have used the Eastern Gate information to destroy Moretti before Moretti could move. Quietly, quickly, completely. He looked at the window. And it would have worked. Short term. And long term. Long term, a dead or ruined Moretti becomes a warning. Everyone around me learns that information is a weapon I use without hesitation. And they adjust accordingly. They hide more from me. They trust me less. They start looking for their own exits. He turned to face her. My father ran the same organization for 20 years, and at the end of those 20 years, he was more isolated than when he started. More powerful in theory. More alone in practice. She held that. You don't want that. I want to build something that survives me, he said simply. Things built on fear don't survive the thing that made them afraid. Take away the fear, and the whole structure collapses. I need something that holds on its own. She looked at him. This man, this complex and exhausting, and occasionally astonishing man, standing at a window in Lower Manhattan, talking about legacy in the language of a builder. You know the hardest part of what you're trying to do, she said. Tell me. You're trying to change the rules of a game while you're still in it, she said. The other players spent their whole lives learning the old rules. They're better at those rules than anyone. And you're standing in the middle of the game saying the rules are different now, and you can't stop playing while you say it. He looked at her. Yes, he said. That's exactly it. Most people can't do that, she said. Changing the rules from the inside. It requires you to be better at the old game than everyone else, while simultaneously refusing to play it. Which is why I need people who understand both versions, he said. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite file. It was too layered, too much happening behind it simultaneously. The old language and the new one. She held his gaze. The week after the Moretti meeting changed things in ways Elena had not predicted. She had assumed naively, she understood in retrospect, that the impact of what she did would be contained within the specific context of Marco's business. Information transferred meeting, navigated problem addressed. Clean and bounded. What actually happened was that she became visible in a world where visibility had specific consequences. It started small. The men in Marco's organization, Danny, the others she'd seen moving through the Red Hook building, the people who worked in the layers below Carla's organized overview, began to register her differently. The change was subtle but consistent. She walked into a room and people adjusted to her presence in a way they hadn't 2 weeks ago. Not deference exactly, more like the recalibration of people updating their model of what someone was. Danny was the most visible case. He came to her on the Tuesday after the Moretti meeting while she was still working her lunch shift at Nico's. He appeared at the door out of place in his good suit among the retired regulars and their espressos, and waited until she was between tables. I need to ask you something, he said, and I need it to be between us. She led him to a corner table. She poured him coffee without asking. He was the kind of man who always wanted coffee. There's a man, Danny said. He's been with the organization for 3 years. I've had questions about him for 6 months, but I can't. There's nothing specific. It's more like... He stopped. He says everything right. He does everything he's asked, but something doesn't land. I can't explain it better than that. She looked at him. You want me to meet him? I want you to be in a room where he's talking. I don't want you to do anything. Just listen, she said. Yes. She thought about this. 3 weeks ago, she had been a waitress with a rent problem. Now she was being asked to evaluate someone's loyalty. When? She said. Tomorrow. There's a review meeting. He'll be there. She looked at her coffee cup. Then she looked at Danny, who was watching her with an expression of such studied casualness that she could see right through it to the genuine uncertainty underneath. Bring me in as Carla's assistant, she said. Don't explain me. Let him build his own theory. Danny looked at her for a moment. You learned that from Marco. I learned it from watching Marco, she said. There's a difference. What's the difference? Marco does it strategically, she said. I do it because I'm curious about what theory someone builds when they don't have information. Danny almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen him get to it when the subject wasn't someone else's embarrassment. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock, he said. Thomas will pick you up. He left her with his coffee cup half empty, which she cleared along with the others. Sal appeared from the kitchen. He looked at the door where Danny had just left. He looked at Elena. "That man was wearing a suit that costs $4,000, Sal said. "I know." "He came here to ask you something." "Yes." Sal picked up a glass. He began polishing it. She watched him for a moment and then went back to her tables. At 2 in the afternoon, her phone buzzed. Not Marco. Not Thomas. A number she didn't recognize. She answered, "Ms. Rosie." A man's voice, older, careful. "My name is not important right now. What is important is that you understand something. You are making yourself very visible in a context where visibility attracts attention. Not all of that attention is from people who want what's good for you." She went still. "Who are you?" Someone who has watched the Bellini situation for a long time. Someone who is cautiously not opposed to the direction it is moving. A pause. "But the direction can be stopped. There are people who will try to stop it. And the simplest way to stop a man who is changing is to remove the thing that is helping him change." The line went dead. She stood holding the phone. Keat. Around her, the lunch crowd continued. Mr. Caruso turned a page of his newspaper. The Benedetti sisters argued gently about dessert. She put the phone in her apron pocket. She went back to work with the steady automatic movements of a woman who had learned to keep her hands doing what they needed to do, while her mind went somewhere else entirely. She thought about the words. The simplest way to stop a man who is changing is to remove the thing that is helping him change. She thought about what that meant. She thought about telling Marco. She thought about what he would do if she told him the immediate tightening of perimeter, the additional weight of being protected, the subtle but real shift in her position from someone who moved through this world on her own terms to someone who was being managed. She thought about what her grandmother would say. "You already know what you know," the voice said. Knowing it and telling someone about it are different decisions. Make both of them clearly. She had known from the first night that this was not a safe world. She had told Diane she didn't know what it cost yet. She was beginning to learn. At 6 o'clock, when the dinner crowd thinned and she had 90 minutes before close, Marco called. "How are you?" he said. Just that. She thought about the phone call. She thought about telling him. "I got a call today," she said. "Someone who didn't give their name, warning me that being visible was making me a target." The pause that followed was very short but completely full. "Tell me exactly what they said." She did. His voice when he responded was the flattest she had ever heard it. Not cold-emptied. The tone of a man removing all other signal so that what he was thinking could run clearly. "You should have called me immediately. I was at work." Elena. "I know," she said. "I know. I needed to think about it first." A pause. "What did you conclude?" She thought about it. About visibility and targets and the particular arithmetic of a world where the cost of mattering to someone was that other people noticed. "I concluded that I was always going to be visible once I walked into that restaurant and answered you in Sicilian. The question was never whether. It was when." "That's not the question I'm asking." "I know what question you're asking," she said. "And the answer is that I'm not afraid enough to stop, but I'm aware enough to be careful." A longer pause. "Thomas will be outside your building tonight," Marco said. "Not because I think you can't handle yourself, because I will not be able to think clearly if I don't know someone is outside your building." She thought about protesting. She decided it wasn't the right thing to argue about. "Okay," she said. "And tomorrow when you go to the review meeting with Danny?" She stopped. "How do you know about that?" "Danny told me. He said it was between us. He told me after I called him to discuss security adjustments," Marco said. "He thought I already knew." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Your organization has a communication problem." "My organization has many problems," Marco said. "You're currently helping me solve 3 of them." A pause. "The review meeting is fine. The man Danny has questions about. Trust your instincts. Tell me what you think after. And if my instincts say something you don't want to hear, then tell me that too," he said without hesitation. especially that. She looked at her grandmother's photograph across the room. "Marco," she said. "Yes, the person who called. You have a theory about who it was." It wasn't a question. She could hear the theory in the quality of the pause. "Yes," he said. "Are you going to tell me?" "When I'm certain," he said. "I don't give you incomplete information and ask you to carry it." She thought about that, about the consideration in it, about the difference between being protected and being respected. "Thank you," she said. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow is complicated." He hung up. She looked at the ceiling. Outside Brooklyn moved through its evening. Somewhere outside her building, a man named Thomas sat in a dark sedan, quiet and watchful. Somewhere in Lower Manhattan, in a building that looked like a consulting firm, Marco Bellini was running theories about a phone call and drawing perimeters and fighting in the way she was beginning to understand. He fought everything with patience and precision, and the deeply held conviction that there was a version of this that didn't require destroying everything in order to protect it. She was in that world now, not as a visitor, not as a consultant, not as a waitress who spoke the wrong language in the wrong place at the right time, as someone who mattered to the outcome. That was the thing the caller had said underneath the warning, the thing that is helping him change. She turned off the light. She lay in the dark in her two sweaters with the radiator knocking twice and then going quiet. She was not afraid. She was aware which was different. And she was in, which was different from all of it. The man Danny had questions about was named Reeves. Late 30s clean record inside the organization, the kind of person who generated no friction because he had learned to move through a room without touching the edges of it. Elena sat in the review meeting the next morning as Carla's assistant notepad neutral expression, the practiced invisibility she had spent 3 years perfecting at Nico's, and she watched him. He did everything right. That was the first thing she noticed. Every answer he gave was calibrated, not over-explained, not under-explained, hitting the exact register of someone who had thought carefully about how much to say. He made small self-deprecating comments at the right moments. He deferred to the two men senior to him in ways that looked natural. He looked at people when they spoke to him with the particular quality of attention that telegraphed, "I am taking you seriously." It was very good. It was almost perfect. The problem was that it was the same every time. The calibration never shifted. Normal people, even careful, professional, skilled people, had moments where the performance slipped, where a reaction came out half a second before they could manage it, where a micro-expression crossed their face before the managed version arrived. Not because they were dishonest, because they were human, and being human meant the performance had occasional gaps. Reeves had no gaps. At the 40-minute mark, someone made a joke. Low stakes, the kind of joke that lands in the middle of a dull meeting like a small gift. The three other people at the table laughed, genuine, spontaneous, the unmanaged sound of people who momentarily forgot they were in a meeting. Reeves laughed exactly one beat later, and the laugh was the right length and the right volume. She wrote one word on her notepad, "performed." Then she crossed it out because she didn't want to leave written evidence of anything in this room, and she held the observation in her head instead. When the meeting ended and people were gathering their things, she created a small accident. Her pen rolled off the table near Reeves. He reached for it at the same moment she did. Their eyes met at close range. She smiled. "Thank you." "Of course," he said. She watched his eyes, not what they expressed, what they didn't. The absence of the small human flicker that happened when you were suddenly close to someone you didn't know. The absence of any recalibration. Just the managed surface all the way down. She called Danny when she got outside. "He's performing," she said. "All of it. I can't tell you for who or why, but the man you're watching is watching you back, and he has been for a long time." Danny was quiet for 3 seconds. "You're certain?" "I'm certain something is wrong," she said. "Certain enough that you should be." "What do you want me to do with that?" Danny said, not defensively, genuinely asking. "Don't move on it yet," she said. "Let it sit. The moment you tip him off that you know something's off, you lose whatever advantage you have. She paused. Let Marco decide the timing. You sound like him, Danny said. She wasn't sure how to take that. She decided to take it as accurate. Tell Marco what I told you. Exactly. She went back to Nico's for her afternoon shift. She was clearing the last lunch tables when Marco called. Reeves, he said. Yes. I've had questions about him for 2 months, Marco said. Couldn't locate anything specific. He's careful, she said. Whatever he's doing, he's been trained to be careful. Trained, Marco repeated. The word landed with weight. He doesn't just behave professionally, she said. He behaves like someone who has practiced behaving professionally. There's a difference. The difference is in what's absent. A pause. Who trained him? I don't know, but whoever it is has resources. She set down the tray she was holding. Marco. The phone call yesterday. Yes. You said you had a theory, but you wanted to be certain first. Yes. Are you closer to certain? A pause that told her the answer was yes, but the information was not ready to be given. By the end of the week, he said. It's connected, she said. Not a question. Everything is connected, he said. That's the thing about a system. You pull one thread and you find out how many other things were tied to it. He paused. Stay visible today. Don't change your pattern. She understood what he meant. Whoever was watching wanted to see whether the warning had landed. Changing her pattern would tell them it had. Fine, she said. But I want to know when you know. You'll know when I know, he said. I don't operate differently with you. She thought about that for a moment. About what it meant that this was true, that she had somehow in the space of 3 weeks become someone that Marco Bellini did not operate differently with. She still wasn't sure whether to be moved by it or frightened of it. She decided it was probably both. She kept her pattern. She worked her shift. She took the train home. Thomas was outside her building again, the dark sedan at the curb, and she waved at it as she went in a small gesture, not asking for anything, just acknowledging the presence. She ate dinner. She called Diane. Are you in danger? Diane asked. This had become the opening of most of their calls. I might be in the medium-term vicinity of danger, Elena said, but I'm not in immediate danger. Elena, that's not a reassuring answer. I know. It's the honest one. She sat on her couch. Diane, tell me something normal. My cat knocked over the plant again. Which one? The fern, the one I've had for 7 years, just completely over. Dirt everywhere. Did the fern survive? The fern looks fine, actually. I think it might have needed the disruption. Elena looked at her grandmother's photograph. That's oddly relevant to my life right now. I figured. She went to bed at 10. She slept 6 hours, which was the most she'd slept all week. The week that followed moved fast. 3 days after the review meeting, Danny came to her directly, not through Thomas, not through a call, but in person at Nico's at 7 in the morning, before her shift started, with the expression of a man who had discovered something he wanted to undiscover and couldn't. Reeves has a secondary phone, he said. We found it. He's been in contact with someone in a federal task force. Has been for 8 months. She sat down. 8 months. Started 2 months before Dario got approached by Moretti's man. Danny's voice was very controlled, which meant he was not controlled at all underneath it. We don't know yet if the two things are connected, but the timing says they're connected, she said. Yes. She thought about this. The federal angle changed the shape of everything, not in a way that made it more dangerous necessarily, but in a way that made it more complicated. The Carbone deal, the Eastern Gate. Dario's brother Reeves and his secondary phone, and his 8 months of contact. These were not separate problems. Who knows about this? She said. You, me, and Marco. Has Marco decided what to do? Marco is deciding right now, Danny said. Which is why I'm here. She looked at him. What do you need from me? He wants to talk to you before he decides, Danny said. He said, and this is a quote, "I want to know what she thinks before I know what I think." Something moved through her at that. She didn't examine it directly. She set it aside for later, the way she set aside all the things that were too significant to look at in the middle of a situation that required clarity. "I'll come now," she said. "Let me tell Sal." She found Marco at the Red Hook building in the back room that she had come to think of as his real office. Not the formal conference room, not the consulting firm lobby, but the functional room with the plain furniture and the walls that held nothing decorative, and the quality of a space that had been stripped of everything unnecessary. He was at the table with a single sheet of paper in front of him that she understood contained information she would not be shown in full. He looked up when she came in. "Reeves," she said. "Yes." "Federal contact. 8 months of it." He set the paper face down. Not to hide it from her, she understood he kept things from her only when they were incomplete, and this was his way of signaling that the piece of paper was incomplete information. 3 possibilities. 1. He's been a plant from the beginning, 3 years ago, positioned here for exactly this moment. 2. He was recruited after he was here, someone identified him as an asset and turned him. 3. He went to them voluntarily. Which do you think? 3, he said. The behavioral pattern doesn't match 1 or 2. 1 and 2 both require a handler relationship that shows in how people operate small behavioral dependencies, check-ins that look like something else. Micromanagement disguised as routine. Reeves shows none of that. He operates entirely independently. He went to them because he wanted out, she said. That's my read. She thought about it. A man who had been inside the organization for 3 years and wanted out. Not turned, not planted. Someone who had made a decision at some point that he didn't want to be where he was anymore and had found a way to make that decision actionable. What does he know? She said. More than I'd like, less than they'd need. Marco's voice was careful. There's a window. What he's given them so far is enough to be problematic, but not enough to be structural. If I move correctly in the next week, the window closes. What does moving correctly look like? He looked at her. That's why I wanted to talk to you first. She understood what he was asking. Not what to do about Reeves. She wasn't equipped to answer that, and they both knew it. He was asking something larger. He was asking the question underneath the question. You want to know whether this changes what you're building, she said. Tell me what you think, he said. Honestly, no management. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the past 3 weeks, about Dario and his brother, and the 8 months of agonizing choices between bad options. About Moretti and his exhaustion, and the way he'd said, I'm so tired in a language he didn't know anyone heard. About Danny, who had walked into Nico's at 7 in the morning, because Marco had asked for her input before his own. The fact that Reeves wanted out doesn't mean he's wrong about what he was leaving, she said. Marco went still. I'm not saying he did the right thing, she said quickly. The method he chose has consequences you're dealing with right now. I'm saying that a man inside your organization deciding that he needed an exit, that's information about what it's like to be inside your organization. Silence. Even in the new version, she said. Even with everything you're trying to change, there are still people in your world who feel like there's no way out that isn't dangerous. And that feeling, the feeling that leaving requires a federal contact, that's a structural problem. That's not about Reeves specifically. Marco sat with that for a long time. She watched him take it in. Not defend against it, not find the logical counter. Just receive it and let it sit in the space where it had landed. My father's people didn't leave because leaving was a death sentence, he said finally. Yes. I've been trying to change that. I know. But changing the reality isn't enough if people don't believe the reality has changed. He looked at the table. They're operating on old information, on justified old information. Yes, she said, and that takes time. And in the meantime, people like Reeves make the only calculation available to them with the information they have. He was quiet. "What would you do?" he said. "If you were me." She thought about it seriously. "I would find a way to let him leave that doesn't require him to have done what he did. Not forgive the thing he did that has consequences, and ignoring consequences sends the wrong message. But make it possible for the act of leaving itself to not be a crime. Show people there's a door. Show people there's a door," she said, "so they don't have to build their own exit through the wall." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know what you've done to the way I think," he said. "I've complicated it," she said. "You've expanded it," he said. "Those are different things." She held his gaze. "Handle Reeves," she said. "Do what you need to do about the information. But when it's done, create the door. Formally, structurally. A way out that doesn't require someone to burn everything down to use it." He nodded slowly. "Yes." "And Marco?" "Yes." "Tell your people," she said. "Don't just build it and assume they'll know it's there. Tell them." He looked at her with an expression she was learning to read, the layered one, the one that went in multiple directions simultaneously. "You're very good at this," he said. "I'm good at listening," she said. "You're good at acting on what you hear. Those are different skills." "Yes," he said. "They are. And right now I need both of them." The week that followed was the most complex Elena had navigated since the night she answered in Sicilian and set everything in motion. Reeves was handled not in the way she had feared when she first heard the word used in the context of Marco's world, but in the way Marco had been moving toward a conversation, a consequence, a negotiated conclusion that closed the federal window without adding to the body count. She was not present for it. She understood from Danny's brief account afterward that it had been neither comfortable nor violent, and had arrived at something neither party had anticipated going in. The Eastern Gate situation was resolved within the week, following quietly through channels she didn't have full visibility into, but with the outcome that the secondary access was formally documented and secured in a way that took it off the table as a vulnerability. Dario's brother Paolo came home on a Wednesday. She heard about it from Marco, who called at 7 in the morning to tell her, which was unusual enough in its timing, that she sat up before he'd finished the first sentence. "Paolo Sena is home," Marco said. She let out a breath. "How?" "Nico located the facility. We made an arrangement." A pause. "A legal one. Moretti's man who was holding him has a long list of regulatory violations in his other business interests. It turned out he was very interested in those violations going unnoticed. And now they go unnoticed." "For the time being," Marco said. "In exchange for Paolo." She thought about Dario. About the face of a man who had made the worst choice of his life and lived with it for 8 months, and had somehow on the other side of the confession found himself being helped rather than destroyed. "How is Dario?" she said. "Shaken," Marco said. "Grateful. Confused, I think, about what to do with gratitude he didn't expect." "What are you going to do with him?" "Keep him," Marco said. "In a different role, different access level. He knows what he did, and he knows the cost, and he knows I'm watching. That's more accountability than most people operate under." She was quiet for a moment. "Your father would have—" "Yes," Marco said. "He would have." "And you didn't." "No," he said. "And I want you to tell me if I'm wrong to do it that way." She thought about it honestly, not looking for the answer that would sound right. "Dario is not a bad man who did a bad thing. He's a man in an impossible position who made the wrong choice with the options he had. Keeping him, giving him accountability without destruction, that's not soft. That's accurate." A pause. "Say that again." "It's not soft. It's accurate." "That's the word I've been looking for," he said. She almost smiled. "You're welcome." "Dinner," he said. "Tonight. The restaurant." She stopped. "Nico's—" "Yes." She thought about this, about what it meant that he wanted to go back to the place where all of this started, about the particular weight of returning to beginnings. 8 o'clock, she said. 8 o'clock, he said, and hung up. She went through her shift. She told Sal, who received the information, that Marco Bellini was coming in for dinner the way he received most things, by picking up a glass and polishing it. "He's coming back," Sal said. "Yes." "Will it be like last time?" She thought about last time. 7 men in suits, the entire restaurant going silent. Mr. Caruso stopping mid-sentence. "No," she said, "I don't think so." Sal polished the glass for a moment. "You've changed something," he said. She looked at him. Sal, who had been in Palermo in the 60s and Brooklyn in the 80s, and who claimed nothing surprised him. "The boy," Sal said. "Something about him has changed." "It's been changing for a while," she said. "I don't think I'm the cause of it. I think I'm—" She searched for the right word. "The reason he let it happen," Sal said. She looked at him. Sometimes the oldest people in the room said the thing that took everyone else 3 more weeks to find. "Yes," she said. "Maybe that." Marco arrived at 8 o'clock. He came alone. She noticed this immediately. No Danny, no Thomas waiting by the door, no men distributing themselves through the restaurant. He walked in by himself in a dark coat and sat down at the corner booth and looked across the table at the chair where she was already sitting. "You're early," he said. "I work here," she said. He almost smiled. It was the fullest version of it she had seen. Not the almost, not the corner movement, but an actual brief smile that crossed his face and left something warmer in its wake. She brought him coffee without being asked. He accepted it without comment. For a while they were simply there in the restaurant where it started, in the booth where 7 men had sat on a Tuesday night in October, and a waitress with a dead grandmother's language had answered in the wrong voice and set something in motion that neither of them could have predicted. "How much do you understand?" Marco said, "about what's happened in the last month?" "More than I did," she said. "Less than you." "That's temporary," he said. "You learn fast." "I listen well," she said. "It's not the same thing?" "In this context it is." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, the way he always did. Both hands settled like a man who had learned to be still by practice rather than nature. "I want to tell you something." She waited. "When I was 17, he said, my father took me to a meeting. Old style, the kind he ran, the kind his father ran, the kind where men sat in rooms and performed for each other, and everyone understood that the performance was the point. Power showing power. Fear performing for fear." He paused. "Afterward, he told me this is how it works. This is how it has always worked. And if you want to survive, you learn to be better at this than anyone else." And I understood, sitting in that car with him at 17, that I was going to spend the rest of my life either learning to be better at that performance or finding a different way entirely. He looked at the table. "I chose the second one, and for 20 years I have been fighting to build it. Alone, mostly. Because most people around me were trained for the first version." She was quiet. "You are the first person," he said, "who has understood both versions without being part of either one. Who could see the old language from outside it and the new one from outside that. Who could stand in the room and hear what was actually being said." "I grew up outside most things," she said. "It gives you perspective." "It gives you something rarer than perspective," he said. "It gives you clarity. Clarity about what things actually are instead of what they perform as being." She thought about her grandmother, about the village 4 miles from his grandfather's village, about 2 families carrying the same mountains across the same ocean to the same city and handing the sound of it down to 2 people who ended up 30 years later in this booth. "I have to tell you something too," she said. He looked at her. "I came into this because of $412, she said. That was true. The rent was real. The number was real. The desperation that made the decision feel possible was real. I don't want to pretend it was something cleaner." "I know," he said. But somewhere in the last month, she said, the $412 stopped being the reason. He was watching her with the full quality of attention he brought to everything. The kind that didn't divide itself, didn't manage itself, was simply there. What replaced it? He said. She thought about it. About Dario's face when he said, "God forgive me." About Moretti saying he was tired in a language he thought no one understood. About Danny walking into Nico's at 7 in the morning because Marco wanted her opinion before his own. About a man trying to change the rules of a game from the inside while the game was still being played. The work, she said. The actual work. What it does. What does it do? It changes the shape of things, she said. Not dramatically, not all at once. But Dario's brother is home. Moretti is tired of war and has a way out that preserves his dignity. Reeves has a consequence that doesn't end him. Your organization has a door in it now, where there was only a wall. She paused. None of those things would have happened the same way without what I heard in those rooms, and I can't unknow that. No, he said. You can't. So I'm not leaving, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not performing gratitude or loyalty. I'm telling you a practical fact. I can do something here that matters, and I'm not going to walk away from that because it's complicated or because it's sometimes frightening. He looked at her for a long moment. Okay, he said. That's all okay. What would you prefer I say? She thought about it. Nothing, she said. Okay is right. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. Outside Brooklyn moved through its evening the sounds of a November night in a city that had seen everything and absorbed everything and continued regardless. There's one more thing, Marco said. She waited. The person who called you, he said. The warning. You know who it was. I know who it was, he said. It was Leo Carbone. She went still. The Carbone family. The ones Moretti was going to make the deal with. Yes, when Moretti canceled the arrangement, Leo Carbone needed to understand why. He started pulling threads. He found you faster than I expected. Marco's voice was even. He wanted to see if you could be frightened off. Could I? She said. No, he said. Which is what I told him. She looked at him. You spoke to him. Yesterday, he said. I told him what you are. Not what you do for me. What you are. And I told him that moving against you was the clearest way he could communicate to me that he was an enemy, because I don't have allies. I have people I trust and people I don't. And the people I trust, he paused, are not negotiable. The word landed the way his words sometimes landed, precisely without excess, in exactly the space they were meant to fill. She held it for a moment. What did he say? She said. He said he understood, Marco said. He said it in a way that suggested he found it interesting that I would take that position about a waitress from Brooklyn. And what did you say? I said she hasn't been a waitress from Brooklyn for a while now, Marco said, and that if he needed me to explain the difference, he probably couldn't afford the conversation. She was quiet. Was that accurate? He said. She thought about the last month, about who she had been when she walked into this restaurant at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday and who she was sitting in this booth now. The rent, the $412, the job, the language, the grandmother, the mountains. Yes, she said. It was accurate. He nodded once. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere down the block, someone was playing music. Something old, something Italian, drifting through the November air, with the particular wistfulness of things that survived by being beautiful enough to remember. She thought about something she wanted to say and held it for a moment, turning it over, deciding whether it was the right time. She decided it was. You know what I keep thinking about? She said. Tell me. Your grandfather and my grandmother, 4 miles apart, same mountains, same language. Both of them carrying it across the ocean, both of them keeping it private, both of them handing it down without knowing what they were handing down. She paused. Neither of them could have known that 60 years later, in a restaurant in Brooklyn, the people they gave it to were going to need it, specifically, precisely, in exactly the way they gave it. Marco was quiet. My grandfather died when I was 12, he said. I remember the last time he spoke Sicilian to me. He said, I'm telling you this language because there will be a day when English isn't enough. He didn't explain what he meant. He just gave it to me. She felt something tighten in her chest. My grandmother said almost the same thing. She said, "The day will come when you need words that nobody around you can hear. That's when you'll understand why I gave you these ones." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the opposite of empty. It was the fullest silence she had ever sat in, two people in a corner booth in Brooklyn on a November night, carrying the same mountains between them, understanding for the first time the full shape of what they had been given. "They knew," Marco said. "They couldn't have known." "No," he said. "But they knew." She let that be what it was. Some things were true even when they weren't logically possible. Her grandmother had taught her that too. Sal appeared from the kitchen. He looked at the two of them. He set down a plate of food bread, the good cheese olives, without being asked. He said nothing. He went back to the kitchen. It was the most he had ever communicated with the fewest words. Elena looked at the plate and then at Marco, and they ate like people who had decided without discussion that they were staying for a while. Over the next 2 months, Elena Rossi stopped being the woman who worked at Nico's on Fulton Street. She didn't quit. She told Sal she needed to reduce her shifts, and Sal listened and polished a glass and said, "Keep Tuesday evenings. You belong here on Tuesday evenings." She kept Tuesday evenings, but the rest of her hours went somewhere else. She became, there wasn't a clean word for it, and she resisted the ones people tried to give her. Not an advisor because that was too formal and too limited. Not a partner because that word had specific weight in Marco's world, and she was careful about weight. She decided the person who understood what was being said in rooms where things needed to be heard. Her first formal role was with 3 families who had long-standing agreements with the Bellini organization. Older arrangements built in the language of a previous generation, full of inherited misunderstandings that had calcified over decades into genuine conflict. Marco sent her to 3 separate meetings alone with Thomas driving, and she sat with old men and their grandchildren, and she listened in Sicilian and English, and the places where they blurred, and she came back each time with the real conversation underneath the performed one. The first family's conflict was about respect, not money. She told Marco. He shifted his approach. The conflict resolved in one subsequent meeting. The second family's issue was a specific clause in a 30-year-old agreement that nobody had read carefully in 20 years. She found it. She explained it. Both sides were so relieved they didn't know what to do with themselves. The third family was more complicated. Their patriarch was dying, and his sons disagreed about everything, and what looked from the outside like a negotiation was actually a family in grief performing at each other across a table. She told Marco this. He canceled the meeting and sent the family something else entirely, a gesture of respect, personal, in the old language of what respect looked like in their tradition. She helped him get the gesture right. All 3 families stabilized. Danny stopped being skeptical the week after the Reeves situation and started being something she had not expected from him, a genuine collaborator, the kind of person who came to her not because Marco had sent him, but because he'd decided on his own that she saw things he didn't. He had the good sense not to make a big deal of this, which she appreciated. Carla, who had always been organized and precise and somewhat opaque, became gradually more legible. She came to Elena one afternoon and said, "You understand what he's trying to do in a way that I understand strategy, but not intention. I would like to understand it better." Elena spent 2 hours with her. Carla thanked her once briefly and did not become warm or demonstrative, but she became something Elena valued more than warmth, reliable. Thomas continued to drive her and say very little and be present in the particular steady way that she had come to think of as one of the most undervalued forms of care, the care that didn't announce itself but simply remained. Moretti came back to the table in December as Marco had said he would. The renegotiated dock agreement was signed a week before Christmas. Elena was in the room. Moretti shook her hand when he left and said in Sicilian, "Your grandmother would be proud." She answered him in Sicilian. "She would have an opinion. She always had an opinion." He laughed, a real one, sudden and unmanaged, the kind that surprised even him, and left. Marco looked at her from across the table. She lifted one shoulder. He almost smiled. By January, the organization Marco Bellini was trying to build looked meaningfully different from the one his father had left him. Not transformed change at that scale didn't happen in months, and she would have been suspicious of anyone who claimed otherwise. But the direction of it was different. The tone of rooms was different. The way people talked to each other when they thought no one important was listening was different. She knew, because she listened when she wasn't supposed to matter. She was in the Red Hook building on a Thursday afternoon in early February when she overheard two men she barely knew talking in the kitchen while she was walking past. She wasn't the subject of the conversation. She was background furniture, nobody. One of the men said, "The thing about him now is, you can actually tell him something he doesn't want to hear." The other man said, "Yeah." "When did that start?" A pause. "October, I think. Around October." She kept walking. She didn't mention it to Marco. Some things didn't need to be reported. Some things were simply evidence, and the evidence was enough. On a Tuesday evening in late February, she worked her shift at Nico's. Mr. Caruso came in with his crossword. The Benedetti sisters argued about the tiramisu. The kitchen ran too hot. The chair by the kitchen door still wobbled. At 8:30, Marco came in. He sat at the corner booth. She brought him coffee without being asked. He accepted it without comment. She sat down across from him because she had earned the right to sit down in this restaurant, and she knew it. "Good day," she said. "Better than most," he said. "Any particular reason?" He looked at her with those eyes that processed everything and had, over the course of 4 months, begun to reveal a little more of what they processed. "We finalized the structure for the exit protocol. The door Danny will announce to the organization next week." She felt something warm move through her. "How many options?" "3 tiers," he said. "Full exit role transition and reduced involvement with maintained benefits. Legal counsel provided at no cost. No questions asked about motivation." He paused. "Danny's already had 2 people approach him privately to say they're interested." "2," she said. "2 people who would have otherwise built their own exits through the wall," he said. She thought about Reeves, about the cost of the absence of a door. "Good," she said. "It was your idea," he said. "It was the right idea," she said. "It was going to arrive eventually." "Maybe," he said. "But it arrived in October, specifically, in this restaurant." She looked at the table, at the old wood, the scratches in it, the decades of weight it had held without complaint. "I keep thinking about something," she said. "Tell me." "I almost didn't answer you," she said. "That night. I almost let it go. You were angry and speaking in a language I recognized, and I almost just kept walking." "What stopped you?" he said. She thought about it. She had thought about it before many times, and arrived at different answers depending on the day. Tonight she arrived at the truest one. "My grandmother," she said. She always said, "The moment that asks something of you, you'll know it. Don't walk past it." Marco was quiet. "I almost walked past it," she said. "I was tired and my feet hurt, and I had $11 in my checking account. I almost walked past it." "But you didn't," he said. "No," she said. "I didn't." He looked at her. The corner booth. The same restaurant. The same city that had watched both of them from a distance, indifferent and relentless, asking nothing and offering nothing and continuing regardless. "I have been in this business for 20 years, Marco said. "I have worked with lawyers and strategists and men who have done this their entire lives. I have paid for intelligence that cost more than some people make in a year." He paused. "No one has done what you have done. Not in the way you have done it." "I listened," she said. "You heard," he said. "There's a difference. Everyone in this business listens. You heard." She thought about her grandmother, about the mountains, about a language carried across an ocean and handed down without instruction in how to use it, only in how to receive it. "She gave me a gift," Elena said. "And I didn't know what it was for 26 years. "Now you know," he said. "Now I know," she said. Outside February moved through Brooklyn with the particular persistence of a winter that was almost finished, but not yet gone cold still, but with something underneath it, the faint structural shift of a city beginning to remember that it had survived every winter before this one and would survive this one too. Inside Nico's on Fulton Street, a woman and a man sat in a corner booth and drank coffee in a silence that had nothing left to fill. She had walked into this restaurant 3 years ago with nothing but a dead grandmother's language and a talent for being present in rooms where people forgot to look. He had walked into it 4 months ago with the weight of a world he'd inherited and the conviction that it could be changed and the exhaustion of trying to change it alone. They had met in the middle of a sentence spoken in the voice of 2 villages 4 miles apart, passed down through 2 families across 60 years, carried in 2 people until the night they needed to use it. A poor waitress. A powerful mafia boss. One forgotten language that neither of them had known until the moment it mattered was the most important thing they owned. The rest of the city could keep its certainties. These 2 had something rarer. They had been heard.